Caleb Whitmore hadn't cried since the day they buried his mother. He knelt in the summer dirt with a woman bleeding through his hands, a stranger who'd ridden hard and collapsed 100 yards from his door, and something cracked open behind his ribs that he hadn't felt in 15 years. Her lips moved. She said 3 words. And nothing about his life on that mountain was ever going to be the same again. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and come along for the ride. Drop the name of your city in the comments so I can see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. The summer of 1878 came to the Montana Territory like a punishment. The grasses along the high ridge lines turned brittle and gold by the first week of July, and the creek beds that fed the lower ranches dropped to little more than muddy ribbons threading through cracked earth. Cattle grew lean, tempers grew short, and men who'd spent all winter believing in spring found themselves staring at August skies that gave back nothing. Caleb Whitmore didn't believe in much of anything by that point, and he figured that was the only reason the summer didn't break him the way it broke everyone else. He was up before first light the way he'd been every morning for 15 years. Not because anyone was waiting on him, not because there was a family to feed or a wife calling his name from the doorway. He rose because the work was there and the work didn't care what he felt, and that arrangement suited him fine. His forge sat at the near edge of his property, a low stone structure he'd built himself the second winter after he came to that mountain. The bellows were old, but reliable. The anvil had belonged to a man named Herschel Grady, who'd given up on Montana and gone back east, and Caleb had bought it for $3 and hauled it up the slope on a mule that nearly killed both of them in the process. There was a satisfaction in that anvil, a permanence. It didn't go anywhere, and it didn't ask anything of him. And every morning, when Caleb set his hands on the worn iron surface, something in him settled down quiet. He was working a cracked axle head for Tom Briggs that morning. Tom was a widower with 4 children under the age of 10 and a piece of land that required twice the labor it was worth, and he couldn't afford to replace the piece outright. He'd ridden up 2 days prior with the broken part wrapped in cloth, eyes cast down, and started in on some complicated explanation about paying Caleb back over time. Caleb had taken the piece from his hands before he got halfway through the sentence. "Don't need your money, Tom." "Caleb, I said don't need it." He'd turned the cracked metal over in his hands, already calculating the heat it would want. "Come back Thursday." Tom had stood there another moment, hat in his hands, looking like a man who didn't know what to do with something given freely. Then he'd nodded and ridden back down the mountain without another word. That was generally how things went with Caleb Whitmore. He didn't talk much, and he didn't explain himself, and he didn't expect anyone to understand why he did the things he did. He repaired tools for widows who had nothing. He rode out in bad weather to pull calves when neighboring ranchers were in too poor a shape to manage alone. He sent word down to Reverend Moss whenever he killed a deer, and the meat went to whoever needed it most. None of this made him popular in Ridgefall. The town of Ridgefall sat 8 miles down the mountain road from Caleb's property, built along a creek that fed the low valley ranches. It was the kind of town that had grown fast during the early cattle years, and then stopped growing abruptly when the railroad decided to run its line 40 miles south. What was left was a permanent population of about 300 people, a general store, 2 saloons, a church, a land office, and a collective bad mood that had lasted the better part of a decade. People in Ridgefall talked about Caleb the way they talked about weather. Not because they found him interesting, but because he was there, and sometimes he caused problems for them. Whitmore's up there sharpening hatchets for every drifter who crosses his property line. Someone would say at the saloon, "Heard he turned down good money from Harlan's crew last spring." Man's strange, always been strange. He'd heard variations of it his whole adult life. It didn't touch him. He'd made peace somewhere back in his early 30s with the fact that the people of Ridgefall were never going to understand him. And that was fine, because he didn't particularly need them to. What he didn't expect, what he'd stopped expecting the way a man stops expecting certain seasons to ever come back, was for any of that to change. Mola. He had the axle piece at temperature, the metal singing under the hammer in that particular rhythm that required everything, and let him think about nothing when he heard the horse. Not the careful sound of a rider coming up on purpose. Something else. Something wrong in the way the hooves were hitting too fast, too uneven, the rhythm of an animal pushed past its limits. Caleb set the hammer down and walked out from under the forge's awning. The road that led up to his property was a quarter-mile of hard-packed dirt through scrub pine, and what came down that road was a gray mare running full out with her sides heaving and her eyes showing white. The rider was barely staying in the saddle, slumped forward, hands twisted into the mane rather than holding the reins proper. He moved before he decided to move. Stepped into the road, arms out, voice low and steady. "Whoa, easy girl, easy." The mare didn't want to stop. Whatever had driven her up that road was still in her legs, still in her blood. But she was exhausted, and the familiar presence of a man who didn't panic registered somewhere in her animal brain, and she slowed, and then she stopped trembling. The rider fell. Caleb caught her before she hit the ground barely. She was heavier than she looked, or maybe he was just off balance from lunging, and they both went to one knee in the road dust. He had his hands on her arms, and her face was pressed against his shoulder, and she was breathing, but wrong. Shallow. Too fast. He pulled back to look at her. She was young, late 20s maybe. Dark hair matted with sweat and road dust. A dress that had once been plain practical green was torn at the sleeve and stained dark at the shoulder where something had been bleeding. Not recently. Hours old, maybe more. Her eyes were open. They were gray and they were frightened, and they were looking straight at him with the particular focus of a person who has spent their last reserves of strength on staying conscious for this one moment. "Miss." He kept his voice level. "Can you hear me?" "Whitmore." Her voice was barely there, cracked dry. "You're Caleb Whitmore." He didn't ask how she knew his name. "That's right. I need—" She stopped. Her jaw tightened like she was fighting for the words. "Don't let them take it. Don't let them—" Her eyes went unfocused, and her body went slack against him. "Hey." He caught her again. "Hey, stay with me. Miss—" But she was gone. Not dead. He could feel the breath still moving in her, thin and unsteady. But whatever thread of will had kept her upright was cut, and there was nothing left to work with. Caleb held her there in the road for 2 seconds, maybe 3 long enough to understand what he was doing and commit to it. Then he gathered her up, all of her dead weight, and carried her toward the cabin. He'd made it basic over the years, basic the way things get when no one else is going to have opinions about them. A front room with a table and 2 chairs and a stove that worked, a bedroom with a single bed and a chest for clothes, a small back room he used for storage, clean, ordered, quiet in the particular way of places that never had much noise to begin with. He put her on the bed. He built the fire up and put water on to heat. He went back out and got the mare settled. She was in rough shape, ribs showing shoe loose on the left rear. And then he came back and did what needed doing. The shoulder wound was a graze, a bullet, and it wasn't old, closer to 12 hours than more, which changed things considerably. He cleaned it with what he had and wrapped it tight. There were bruises across her ribs that worried him more than the shoulder. The kind of marks that came from a fall or a blow or both. While he worked, he looked for anything that would tell him who she was. She carried no purse, no papers on her person. The mare had no brand he recognized, and the saddle was old and without identifying marks. There was a saddlebag, and in it he found 3 things: a small knife with a carved bone handle, a folded map of the Upper Gallatin Valley, with notations in pencil that meant nothing to him yet, and a deed. He unfolded the deed carefully, the paper soft with age and handling. The property was described in the legal language of the time, meets and bounds creek references, landmark descriptions, but he understood enough of it to get the geography. Upper Gallatin, high ground, the kind of land that would sit above most of the valley ranches, which meant it sat above their water. The name on the deed was Eleanor Hayes. He looked at the woman on his bed, and then he looked at the deed, and he thought about what she'd said. Don't let them take it. He sat in the chair by the bed and waited for her to wake up. She slept for 6 hours. He used the time. He ate barely and kept the water hot and watched the road from the front window. No one came up the mountain. The afternoon stretched long and still, the summer heat pressing down even at this elevation, and Caleb sat with it and didn't let himself think too far ahead. A woman shot and riding hard to his property specifically, asking for him by name. He turned that over while the hours passed. He didn't know an Eleanor Hayes. He would have remembered the name, the face. She hadn't looked at him like a stranger, though. She'd looked at him like a man she'd been told to find, which was different and which meant someone had sent her to him, or at least had pointed her in his direction. He couldn't figure the shape of it yet, so he stopped trying. The shape would come from her when she woke up. Around 6 in the evening she moved. Caleb was across the room at the table, and he didn't make a move toward her. He just watched and let her come up out of it on her own. She went through the stages of it, the confusion, the sharp intake of breath, the hands moving instinctively to check herself, finding the bandage at her shoulder going still. Then her eyes opened and found the ceiling, and then found him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "You're safe," he said. "You're at my place. You rode in about noon near unconscious." She pushed herself up on her good arm jaw, tight with the effort. "How long?" 6 hours near enough. "I need to—" She started to swing her legs off the bed. "You need to stay put." He didn't move, but he let the words land flat and sure. "You've got a bullet graze at your shoulder that's been running for better than half a day and bruising across your ribs that says someone either threw you or you fell hard. You start moving around before that shoulder closes, you'll open it back up." She stopped, looked at him. "Eleanor Hayes," he said. "That's your name on the deed." Something shifted in her expression. Not fear exactly, more like the recalculation a person does when they realize how much someone else already knows. "You went through my saddlebag." Looking for a name and someone to notify. Wasn't snooping. He paused. "I found the deed too. A long beat." She watched him with those gray eyes, and he got the sense she was measuring something, not his physical size, which was not something that required measuring, but something else. His character, maybe. The way a person looks at a door before they decide whether to open it. "Caleb Whitmore," she said. "My father spoke of you." He went still. "Who's your father?" "Daniel Hayes." She watched his face. "He died in February." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Daniel Hayes. He ran it back through time and memory searching. "I don't know the name," he said. "He knew you. Said you were the only man in this territory who couldn't be bought." Her voice was steadier now, gathering strength the way a fire will when it catches proper. "He said if something happened to him, and if they came for the land, I was to find you." "Who's they?" She looked at him. "Miss Hayes." He kept his voice level. "You rode to my place with a bullet in your shoulder and told me not to let them take your land before you passed out. I need a name." She was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then Garrison Holt. The name hit the room like something dropped. Caleb didn't react visibly. He'd learned young to keep his reactions off his face. But internally, the thing that happened was the same thing that happens when a man who's been working around an old abandoned mine shaft for years finally hears the ground give a warning sound underfoot. Garrison Holt was not from Ridgefall. He operated out of Bozeman and Helena both, and his name came attached to words like syndicate and water rights and land consolidation, which were the polite words for what he did. The less polite words were what people used quietly among themselves when they were sure no one connected to Holt could hear them. Men who crossed Garrison Holt had a way of turning up in bad situations that couldn't quite be proven to be anyone's fault. "Your father's land," Caleb said slowly. "Upper Gallatin. 80 acres of high ground with 2 creek sources." She met his eyes without flinching. "Those creeks feed 7 valley ranches. If Holt controls the headwaters, he controls the ranches. All of them." Caleb leaned back in his chair and looked at the woman on his bed and understood with the clarity that comes from seeing a thing whole all at once exactly what he'd walked into. "How'd he find out your father was gone?" he asked, My father filed the deed transfer 4 days before he died. Put it into my name." Her jaw tightened. Holt had someone in the land office. By the time I knew what was happening, there were men on my property telling me the deed was fraudulent. "Is it?" "No." The word came out hard as iron. "The deed is good. My father had it witnessed proper and registered in the county. But Holt has a lawyer in Helena who's producing a competing claim, and he's had the Ridgefall land office shut up tighter than a drum for 3 weeks. I can't get access to the registration records to prove the filing was timely." Caleb absorbed that, looked at the deed still on the table where he'd left it, back at her. "You said someone shot you." "2 of Holt's men, yesterday morning." The steadiness in her voice was something earned, not given. He could hear the cost of it underneath. "I got out through the back before they could—" She stopped. Started again. "I left with what was on the mare, and I rode." "And you rode to me?" "My father said to find you." She looked at him directly. "I didn't have a better idea." Caleb was quiet for a long time. Outside, the summer dark was coming down the mountain, holding its heat even as the light went. A coyote called somewhere up the ridge, and the mare in the paddock shifted and blew a breath. "I fix tools," he said finally. "That's what I do. I'm a blacksmith on a mountain 8 miles from a town that wouldn't cross the street to spit on me. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a lawman. I'm not a man who goes up against Garrison Holt." "I know," she said. "Then why?" "Because my father said you were the only man who couldn't be bought." Her voice didn't crack, but it came close. Not couldn't, as in didn't have a price. Couldn't as in Holt's already tried. My father watched him try years ago. Watched him offer you money and land, and watched you turn him down flat without blinking. She paused. He said you were the last honest man on this mountain. The silence between them went long and complicated. Caleb stood up from the table, walked to the window, stood there looking out at the dark. The last honest man on this mountain. He didn't know if that was a compliment or a burden, and he suspected it was neither. Suspected it was just a fact, the way certain facts about a man accumulate over time without him choosing them, the way water runs downhill, not because it wants to, but because that's the shape of the ground. "Your father's name," he said without turning around. "Daniel Hayes. He ran cattle. Cattle and horses. Died of fever. The doctor said pneumonia. And you think it wasn't?" A pause. Then, "I think the timing was convenient." He turned around and looked at her then. Looked at the bandaged shoulder, and the bruises he couldn't see under the dress, but knew were there, and the gray eyes that were frightened under the steadiness, frightened the way a person gets when they've been frightened for a long time, and have gotten very good at covering it. "Holt's man," he said. "The competing claim. What name is it under?" "The Gallatin Valley Land and Water Concern." She reached into the neck of her dress and produced a folded paper. She'd been carrying it on her person, not in the saddlebag, which told him she'd prioritized it above everything else, and held it out to him. He crossed the room and took it. It was a copy of the competing claim, handwritten with a seal from the Helena Land Office, and a date that was 3 days after Eleanor Hayes's deed had supposedly been filed. The language was legal and dense, but the argument was straightforward. The Hayes deed was fraudulent. The original title had been improperly conveyed. The Gallatin Valley Land and Water Concern was the rightful holder. It was well done. He'd seen enough legal documents over the years to recognize that whoever had drafted this knew what they were doing. But he read it again more slowly, and the 3rd time through, he found it. A reference to a survey conducted in April of the current year. A survey that would have been done weeks after Daniel Hayes had already died, referenced as evidence of the concern's prior occupancy and use of the land. "They made a mistake," he said. Eleanor straightened. "What?" He crossed back to her and held the paper out so she could follow. "This survey, April 14th. Your father died in February. If the concern had any legal claim at all, they'd have to show occupancy before his death. But they're dating their survey to April, which means they're claiming occupancy on land that was legally in your name from the moment he transferred it." He tapped the page. They can't survey their own property in April if the property was in your name starting in February. The dates don't work. She stared at the page. Then she looked up at him. That's their error, she said. That's their error. He handed the paper back. Problem is, the Ridgefall Land Office is the one place where you can pull the original registration with the correct dates and show the discrepancy. And you said Holt has that locked up. He does. Her voice was careful now, careful the way a person gets when they can see a door that might be opening. But there's a Federal Land Commission office in Bozeman. If someone could get there with the original deed and that competing claim and lay out the timeline, a federal land commissioner has authority over a county land office. He could compel the records to be produced. Bozeman is 4 days' ride. I know. Caleb looked at the deed again, then at Eleanor Hayes. The thing he was being asked, it wasn't being asked in so many words, but it was there between them clear as spoken language was not a small thing. Going to Bozeman with documents that put him directly in opposition to Garrison Holt was not a morning's work. It was a choice of the kind that reorganized a man's life sometimes permanently in directions he couldn't predict. He thought about Tom Briggs and his 4 children and his broken axle. He thought about the 7 valley ranches Eleanor Hayes had mentioned, 7 families, probably 40 or 50 people between them, whose water would run at Garrison Holt's pleasure if those creek headwaters changed hands. He thought about Daniel Hayes, who'd died of fever in February at a very convenient time. You need to eat, he said. Eleanor blinked. Before we talk any more about Bozeman or Garrison Holt or anything else, you need food and water and another few hours of rest. He was already moving toward the stove. How long since you ate? She thought about it. Yesterday morning. Right. He pulled the pot forward on the stove and reached for the shelf. There's stew from this afternoon. It'll hold. He heard her exhale behind him, not quite a laugh, not quite relief, but something on the same territory as both. Mr. Whitmore, she said. Caleb. A pause. Caleb. She said his name like she was testing the weight of it. You haven't said yes. No. But you haven't said no either. He didn't turn around. Kept his hands on the work. I'll say this, he said finally. No man worth the name lets a woman get shot twice for the same piece of ground. He set the bowl down and turned to face her. Eat first, then we'll work out what comes next. Something moved across her face that he didn't entirely have a name for. It wasn't gratitude, though. Gratitude was in it. It wasn't relief, though. That was in it, too. It was more like the particular expression of a person who has been holding everything alone for a very long time and has just for the first time been allowed to set a portion of it down. She reached for the bowl, outside the mountain, dark pressed against the windows, and the coyote called again, farther away now, and somewhere down the slope toward Ridgefall. Caleb knew without being told that men were riding toward something they didn't understand yet. He was going to have to be there when they arrived. He just hadn't said so out loud. The next trouble came before sunrise. He'd given her the bed she hadn't argued, which told him how exhausted she truly was, and he'd taken the chair in the front room with his rifle across his knees. Old habit. He'd learned years ago that the first night after a thing like this was when men moved while they thought you were still off balance. He was awake at 3 a.m. when the mare threw her head up in the paddock. Caleb was out the door without a sound. He came around the side of the cabin in the dark, keeping to shadow, and worked his way toward the tree line at the near edge of his property. The summer night was warm and full of insect sound, and underneath it barely there were hoofbeats. 2 horses, moving slow and deliberate, which was worse than fast. Fast meant surprise. Slow meant they already knew where they were going. He was positioned behind a wide pine. By the time they came into view, 2 men riding easy, not trying to be quiet because they didn't think anyone was awake to hear them. One of them had a rifle across his saddle. The other was bigger, riding a dark horse, and he stopped about 20 yards from the cabin door, and looked it over with the casual authority of a man who expects to find what he came for. "Lights out," the big one said. "She's in there." The other one dropped from his horse. "Mitch saw the mare. That's her gray, no question." "Then we go in quiet and bring her out, and we're back down before first light." Caleb stepped out from behind the pine. "Evening," he said. Both men went for their guns. "I wouldn't," Caleb said. His rifle was already up, and his voice was absolutely level. "I really wouldn't." They froze. The big one on horseback. The one on the ground with his hand still on his holster fingers, curled but not committed. Caleb waited. The big one looked at the rifle and then at the man holding it and did the calculation that men do in those moments, assessed the distance, assessed the calm, assessed whether the person opposite him would actually pull that trigger. "Easy, friend," the big one said. "We're just looking for a woman rode through here. She's not here. Now her horse is a horse I bought off a passing trader 2 days ago." He didn't blink. "Seems like he's been looking for her ever since. Can't imagine why." The big one studied him. "You're Whitmore." "I am. Mr. Holt would like a conversation with you." "Mr. Holt can ride up the mountain any time he pleases." Caleb lowered the rifle by 1 degree, just enough to move the immediate threat, not enough to be mistaken for concession. "During daylight hours, alone or near enough. With his lawyer if he wants. I'll be here." He looked at the man on the ground. "What I won't be is surprised in the dark on my own property. Once. That's the only warning I give." A long silence. The big one's jaw worked once. He was measuring Caleb Whitmore against the instructions he'd been given and finding that they didn't quite account for what they'd found. "This ain't finished," he said. "I expect not." The man on the ground remounted. Neither of them took their eyes off Caleb until they were back on the road, and then they rode down and the mountain went quiet again. Caleb stood there in the summer dark for a full minute, listening to the world settle back into itself. Then he turned and walked back toward the cabin. Eleanor was in the doorway. She had his spare rifle, which she'd apparently found in the back room, and she was holding it properly, not like a woman who'd never handled a gun, but like someone who'd been handling them her whole life. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You told them I wasn't here," she said. "Didn't seem like a good time for introductions." She lowered the rifle, let out a breath that was slow and controlled, and probably cost her more than it looked. "They'll come back." "They will. With more men." "Likely." She looked at him across the dark of the doorway, and what was in her eyes was something he recognized, not fear, not exactly. It was the look of a person who has run out of road and knows it, and is trying to figure out how to stand on ground that might not hold. "I'm sorry," she said. "I've brought this to your door." Caleb stepped past her into the cabin. "Bowsman," he said. "We leave at first light. Can you ride?" She came in behind him and set the rifle against the wall. "Yes," she said. "Your shoulder. I can ride." She met his eyes. "Can you get us there?" He looked at her for a long moment in the thin light of the dying stove. "Miss Hayes," he said, "I've been up and down this mountain in worse weather than summer with worse trouble behind me than Garrison Holt." He picked up his rifle and checked the load. "Get some sleep. 2 hours is what you've got." She didn't move immediately. Stood there looking at him with those gray eyes that had stopped being frightened, or had at least stopped showing it. "Caleb," she said. He looked up. "Thank you." She said it plain without decoration, the way real things get said when there's no time for anything else. He nodded once, turned away. 2 hours, he said again. She went. He sat back down in the chair with the rifle across his knees and listened to the mountain, and thought about a man named Daniel Hayes who died in February and had told his daughter to find him, specifically him, if things went wrong. The only man who couldn't be bought. He didn't know if that was true anymore. He didn't know if it had ever been true in the way Daniel Hayes had meant it. All he knew was that there was a woman asleep in his room with a bullet graze on her shoulder, and the kind of trouble behind her that didn't stop once it started, and that somewhere down in the valley, Garrison Holt was going to learn before long that the ground had shifted. 2 hours to first light. He closed his eyes and rested them and kept his hands on the rifle and waited for morning. They rode out before the sun touched the ridge. Caleb went first, Eleanor a half-length behind on the gray mare, and neither of them spoke for the first mile. That was fine. That was how things needed to be, fast and quiet, and without the kind of conversation that slowed a person down when speed was the only thing standing between them and what was coming. The road down to the valley floor split at the old Briggs Junction, and Caleb took them left instead of right away from Ridgefall up through the back timber toward the high pass that most riders avoided because the footing was loose in summer and the trail was barely worth the name. But it cut 12 miles off the route north and kept them off the main road, and right now, those two things were worth every hard step the horses had to take. Eleanor rode without a complaint. He checked on her twice in the first hour, half-turned in the saddle, and both times she was upright and focused and watching the tree line the same way he was. Her shoulder had to be screaming at her. She didn't let it show. They were 2 miles into the timber when she came up alongside him. "They'll know by morning we're gone," she said quietly. "Already know." He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "Those two last night didn't come back down to wait. They went to report. So Holt knows that I lied to him that you're with me and that we're moving." He didn't soften it. "Yes." She absorbed that. "How far ahead do we have?" "Depends on what he does first. If he sends riders up the mountain to confirm we've left, we've got 3 hours, maybe 4. If he sends them straight to cut off the Bozeman Road." He paused. "Less. Which do you think he does?" Caleb thought about it. Garrison Holt was not a man who moved without information. Every account of him said the same thing. He verified before he committed, which meant he'd send someone back up the mountain first, which meant they had 3 hours, which meant they needed to be through the high pass and onto the north road before the sun was fully up. "Ride," he said. She rode. They made the pass by mid-morning and the north road by noon, and Caleb let the horses rest at a creek crossing while he thought through what came next. Eleanor dropped from the saddle, carefully favoring her left side, which she'd been doing all morning, and led the gray down to the water. She didn't ask for help. Didn't look back to see if he was watching. He was watching. "Your father," he said. "Tell me about him." She looked up from the creek. "What do you want to know? How he knew Holt? How long this has been going on?" She straightened and turned to face him, water dripping from her hands where she'd cupped it to drink. "My father homesteaded that land 22 years ago. Built everything himself. He knew what the water rights were worth before most people in the valley even understood the question." She paused. "Holt came to him 7 years back. Wanted to buy the Upper Creek rights, not the land, just the water access. My father said no, and Holt kept coming back. Every 2 years near enough. Different offers, more money each time. My father said no every time." Something moved across her face, grief held at arm's length. "The last time was 18 months ago. Holt sent a lawyer instead of coming himself. My father threw the lawyer off the property." Caleb looked at her. "And then he died of fever 6 months later." "Yes." The word sat between them in the noon heat, loaded with everything she wasn't saying. "You think he was poisoned," Caleb said. She didn't flinch from the word. "I think a healthy man doesn't die of pneumonia in February without reason. I think the timing suggests reason." She met his eyes. "But I can't prove it. And right now I can't even prove the deed is valid without the county registration records. So." She turned back to the gray. One problem at a time. He watched her tighten the cinch on her saddle with one good arm and one that was limited to support jaw set against the effort. "Eleanor," she turned, "you said your father watched Holt try to buy me years ago." He kept his voice level. "That was 11 years back. I was running horses up the North Ridge. Holt's man offered me $300 and a deed to 40 flat acres to look the other way while they redirected a spring that fed the Colton family's land." He paused. "I turned him down." "I know. The Coltons lost that land anyway 3 years later. Different means." She looked at him steadily. I know that too. So you know I'm not a man who wins these fights? You're a man who fights them, she said. That's different. She put her foot in the stirrup and pulled herself up. He saw the flash of pain cross her face and was ready to step forward, and she was already in the saddle before he got one step. My father said that was rarer than winning. Caleb stood there a moment. Then he mounted his horse, and they rode north. The first twist came at a place called Miller's Ford, where the North Road crossed the Gallatin River at a wide, shallow stretch that every rider going to Bozeman had to use. There were 3 men waiting at the crossing. Caleb saw them from 200 yards back and pulled up without a word. Eleanor came alongside and saw them a second later and said nothing, which told him she was paying attention. Holt moved faster than I figured, he said quietly. Those are his men. Don't know the faces. But 3 men sitting still at a river crossing at 2 in the afternoon aren't fishing. He studied them. They're not looking our way yet. Trees on the right run about a quarter mile before the bank opens up. We go through the timber, we come out below the ford and cross downstream. That adds time. It adds less time than getting stopped. She turned the gray without another word. They moved through this timber at a walk, keeping quiet, and came out below the ford, where the river was shallower and wider and the crossing was harder, but passable. The horses didn't love it. Caleb's roan hit a slick stone and lurched, and he sat it out without coming unseated. Eleanor crossed with her reins high and her eyes forward. When they were up the far bank and back in the trees, she let out a slow breath. They didn't see us, she said. Not yet. What does that mean? It means Holt has the main crossing watched, which means he may have other points covered too. He looked at her. How many people know about the deed, about your father's registration? She thought. The lawyer my father used, he's in Helena, name of Stern. He's the one who drew the paperwork. And the land office clerk who registered it. His name is... She stopped. Something changed in her face. What? He said. The clerk. Her voice went careful. His name is Pollard. Martin Pollard. He was... She stopped again. He was the one who told me the registration office was locked. He came to my property and told me personally. She looked at Caleb. I thought he was being helpful. How long after your father died? 3 weeks. Caleb let that sit for a moment. Did Pollard know about the deed filing? Did he process it himself? I don't know who processed it. My father rode down and registered it himself. He didn't tell me who handled the paperwork on their end. So Pollard comes to your property 3 weeks after your father dies, tells you the land office is locked, and that's the first you heard of any problem with the claim. Yes. And Holt has the land office locked up. Yes. He watched her put it together. He could see the moment she got there, not a dramatic moment, not loud, just a quiet cold water comprehension that went through her eyes and settled into the set of her jaw. Pollard works for Holt, she said. More likely than not. Which means Holt knew about the deed filing the moment it was recorded. Which means he's had 8 months to prepare his competing claim, and his lawyers, and his witnesses. Caleb kept his voice steady. And it means whoever registered that deed for your father, whether it was Pollard or someone else, may have been made to disappear from the record of it. Eleanor Hayes looked at the road ahead. For a moment, just a moment, the steadiness she'd been carrying cracked, not completely, but enough to show what was underneath it. A young woman who'd lost her father, and her safety, and nearly her life, and was now learning that the corruption ran deeper than she'd understood. Then she pulled it back. Stern, she said. My father's lawyer in Helena. He was the one who drew the deed. He'll have a copy of everything, the original document, the witness signatures, the date the filing instruction was given. She turned to Caleb. If Stern's copy matches the filing date on the deed and contradicts the concern's claim, it's corroborating evidence. He nodded. Not a guarantee, but it gives the federal commissioner something to stand on when he compels the county records. Then we need to go to Helena first. Caleb looked at her. Helena is west. Bozeman is north. They're not on the same road. I know. She held his eyes. But if we arrive in Bozeman without the corroboration from Stern, Holt's lawyer will tie up the Federal Review for months. With Stern's copy, it becomes a discrepancy in public records. That's different. A commissioner acts on discrepancies. He thought about it. Helena added 2 days minimum. 2 days was a significant difference in terms of what Holt could do to her property, to potential witnesses, to any paper trail that still existed. Holt's watching the Bozeman Road, he said slowly. He may not be watching the Helena Road. He doesn't know we know about Stern. He might figure it. He might. She didn't back down from it. But it's the better hand. Caleb looked at the road ahead for a long moment. The better hand. He turned that over. In his experience, the better hand and the safer hand were rarely the same thing, and a man had to decide which one he was playing before the game got too far along to switch. "Helena," he said. They rode west with the afternoon sun moving against them, and the hours passed in a way that felt both too slow and too fast too slow, because every mile was a mile further into what Holt could do too fast, because the light was going and they needed shelter before dark. Caleb found it at a place he knew, a family named Gentry, who ran sheep on the west slope, and who owed him nothing except that he'd set a broken leg for their youngest son 2 winters back when the doctor couldn't get through the snow. He didn't call in debts, but he recognized when a favor existed. Walt Gentry answered the door with a lamp and a look of mild surprise and said, "Whitmore." Then his eyes went to Eleanor and back to Caleb, and he read the situation fast, the way practical people do. "Supper's still warm," he said, and stepped back from the door. His wife Clara set 2 extra plates without being asked, and the 4 of them sat at the table in the kind of comfortable quiet that practical people understand, the kind where conversation isn't required, but presence is. Eleanor ate carefully. She was fading. Caleb could see it, the shoulder and the riding and the 2 hours of sleep and the day's hard miles were accumulating in the way that debt accumulates, inevitable and collecting interest. Clara Gentry, who was a perceptive woman of about 50, looked at the bandage on Eleanor's shoulder, and then at Caleb and said, "She needs rest." "I know. She can have our spare room." Eleanor opened her mouth. "Yes," Caleb said, before she could decline. She closed her mouth, looked at him. Some irritation in it, but underneath that relief. "One night," he added. "One night." She agreed. After Eleanor had been guided off to the spare room by Clara Gentry, with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a woman who had been managing emergencies her whole life, Walt Gentry poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from Caleb at the cleared table. "Garrison Holt," Caleb said. Walt nodded slowly. He'd heard the name. "You had any trouble with him?" "Not directly." Walt wrapped his hands around the cup. "Man 2 properties east of me, Hatcher. He sold out to one of Holt's land companies last spring. Didn't want to, from what I heard. But there were problems with his water access and his fences kept going down, and after a while it got easier to sell." He met Caleb's eyes. "That kind of trouble." "Yeah." Caleb drank the coffee. "That kind." "The woman's land. Upper Gallatin, 2 creeks." Walt was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's the water for half the valley ranches." 6 or 7. If Holt controls those headwaters, he controls everyone. Walt set down his cup. "What do you need?" "Nothing tonight. Possibly nothing at all. But if someone comes asking about a woman and a man who rode west today..." "We haven't seen anyone in a week." Walt looked at him steadily. "Clara and I have been up with a difficult you the whole time." Caleb nodded. He slept in the barn light with one ear on the world outside. Nothing came in the night. The horses were quiet, and the sheep were quiet, and the summer dark was just dark, which was the best thing it could be. Mine. In the morning, Eleanor came out to the barn while he was saddling the horses. She moved better than the day before. The rest had done something for her, even if it hadn't done everything. She had a piece of paper in her hand. "Clara had paper," she said. "I wrote down what I remember of Stern's address in Helena. I've only been there once when I was 12, but I remember the street." She handed it to him. "In case something happens to me and you have to go alone." He took the paper, looked at it, looked at her. "Nothing's going to happen to you," he said. "Caleb." She said his name the way she'd started saying it, flat direct, without apology. "We both know that may not be true." He folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket. "We're going to Helena," he said. "Together. And then Bozeman. And then Ridgefall." He tightened the cinch on his roan. "And then Garrison Holt is going to learn what happens when he goes after the wrong family." She looked at him for a long moment with those gray eyes. "You keep saying things like that," she said. "Like what? Like you've decided, like this is already something you're committed to." She tilted her head slightly. "You never actually said yes." Caleb looked at her. "I said we leave at first light," he said. "We left at first light. That's not Miss Hayes." He turned to face her fully. "I'm standing in a barn 40 miles from my property with Garrison Holt's men on at least one road between me and where I'm going. My forge is sitting cold, and I've got Tom Briggs's axle piece half finished on the anvil." He paused. "If that's not a yes, I don't know what language you'd prefer." The ghost of something, almost a smile, moved across her face. "Fair enough," she said. "Get on your horse." 10. They were 2 hours out of the Gentry place, moving at a good pace on the Helena road, when Eleanor pulled up short. Caleb was alongside her in a second. "What?" She was looking at a rider coming toward them from the west. Single rider moving at a walk, and from this distance there was nothing alarming about it. Travelers used this road, that was what roads were for. But Eleanor's face had gone still in a way that Caleb had learned to pay attention to. "I know that horse," she said. He looked again. A gray-brown quarter horse, distinctive blaze on the face, moving with the slightly shortened stride of an older animal. "Who?" he said. "That's Martin Pollard's horse." Everything sharpened. Caleb said quietly, "Don't let on. Ride easy. Let him come to us." He kept his voice just above nothing. "If he knows you, he knows you. We deal with it then. If he doesn't, he's just a man on a road." Eleanor nodded. Her shoulders settled. Whatever she was feeling went somewhere internal and stayed there. They rode toward each other at a natural pace, and when the distance closed to 20 yards, the man on the gray-brown horse looked up, and Caleb saw his face, and then watched the exact moment Martin Pollard recognized Eleanor Hayes. It was a half-second thing. The eyes widening, the hands tightening on the reins, and then it was gone, covered over by a look of deliberate neutrality that confirmed everything. "Miss Hayes," Pollard said. He was a thin man in his 40s with clerk's hands and a careful way of sitting a horse. "I didn't expect to find you out this way." "Mr. Pollard," Eleanor's voice was perfectly level. "Funny thing, I didn't expect to see you out this way either." Pollard's eyes moved to Caleb. "And you are passing through," Caleb said. A silence. Pollard's gaze went back to Eleanor, and something in it was calculating. She could see him measuring what to say, what to report, where she was going. "The land office opened up last week," Pollard said. "If you wanted to come back to Ridgefall, the matter of your deed will be handled through federal channels," Eleanor said. "Thank you for letting me know." Pollard's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. "Federal channels," he repeated. "The Bozeman Land Commission," she said. "My father's lawyer in Helena advised it. I'm heading there now." Caleb kept his face neutral and did not look at her. She'd just told Pollard exactly where they were going and why. Every instinct in him went tight. Then he understood. She'd done it deliberately. If Pollard reported to Holt that they were heading to Helena to see Stern, Holt would expect that, would send men to Helena, would focus his attention there, which meant Bozeman would be less watched, not more, because Holt would believe he had time, that they had another stop to make first. It was a gamble, a significant one. But it was smart. "Safe travels, Miss Hayes," Pollard said. "And you, Mr. Pollard." They rode past each other, and Caleb kept his pace easy and his eyes forward until they'd put 200 yards between themselves and Pollard. Then he said without turning his head, "You told him." "I did. On purpose. If he tells Holt we're going to Helena first." Eleanor said, her voice low and rapid. "Holt will focus his men there. He'll try to get to Stern before we do, or have us stopped on the Helena road. But we're not going to Helena." Caleb looked at her. "We're going to Bozeman," she said. "Directly. Now." "You said we needed Stern's corroboration." "I needed Holt looking the wrong direction," she said. "The corroboration, I have it. I've had it." She reached into the front of her dress again the same way she'd produced the competing claim, and this time what she drew out was a sealed letter. "My father gave this to me 2 months before he died. Stern wrote it. It's a signed statement confirming the deed filing date, the witness names, and the legal sequence of the transfer." She held it out to him. "My father said to carry it close and not tell anyone I had it, unless I was standing in front of the federal commissioner." Caleb took the letter, felt the weight of it, paper and wax seal, but heavier than that. He looked at her. "Your father planned for this," he said. "My father knew Holt would come for the land the moment he was gone." Something painful moved through her voice and was controlled. "He didn't plan to die when he did, but he planned for the possibility." She paused. "He was a thorough man." Caleb turned the letter in his hands once and gave it back. "Helena was never the destination," he said. "Bozeman was always the destination." She tucked the letter away. "I needed Pollard to believe otherwise." He thought about it. The gamble was still real. Holt would figure out quickly enough that they weren't going to Helena, and when he did, his attention would swing back to the Bozeman road. But it bought them time, possibly a full day, and a day was enough. "You're better at this than you let on," he said. "I'm my father's daughter," she said. Something in how she said it, quiet with a grief in it, that was also a kind of pride, made him look at her a moment longer than was required. Then he said, "We cut north, back to the Bozeman road. There's a way through the West Ridge that Holt's men won't know." "How long?" "Day and a half if we push." "Then let's push." The West Ridge Trail was everything Caleb had promised, and nothing Eleanor had been prepared for. It was a game trail more than a road, climbing steep and loose through summer-dry rock faces, demanding constant attention from both horse and rider. Eleanor gave it attention. She gave it everything she had, and Caleb tracked that the way her energy was going, the way she was spending what the night at the Gentry's had restored, and the rate at which the account was drawing down. They stopped once in the afternoon when her mare stumbled, and Eleanor's lurch to compensate pulled something in her shoulder. She didn't cry out. He heard the sharp inhale and looked back, and her face was white. He dismounted. "I'm fine," she said. "You're not." He came to her side. "Get down." "Caleb, get down." She got down. He checked the bandage. The shoulder hadn't reopened, but the muscles around it had seized, which was its own kind of problem. He did what he could with the limited materials he carried, rewrapping it tighter, and while he worked, she stood still and stared at the middle distance, with her jaw locked, and said nothing. When he was done, she said, "Thank you." You're a man of extraordinary few words." "Words don't fix shoulders." "No." A pause. "What does?" "Rest, which we don't have." He stepped back. 10 more miles to the top of the ridge, and it gets easier on the other side." She looked at the trail ahead. "My father said you fixed every broken thing on that mountain," she said. "Tools, fences, bones once for the Gentry boy." "Heard about that." "He said you did it because it needed doing and nobody else could." She turned to look at him. "Not for payment, not for credit, just because." He was quiet. "Is that true?" He looked at her steadily. "Some things just need doing." "Yes." She held his gaze. "They do." There was something happening between them that he had no particular name for. He wasn't sure he wanted one. He'd spent 15 years being very deliberate about not having names for things like this, and the habit was strong, and now was not the moment to examine it anyway. "Can you ride?" he said. "Yes." "Then let's ride." They crested the ridge as the sun dropped low, and on the far side the trail widened and the ground leveled, and Bozeman was somewhere out ahead of them in the last light. A day away now, less if the night stayed clear. Caleb made camp at a hollow in the lee of a rock face. No fire. Not tonight, not this close to where they needed to be, and they ate cold from his saddlebag and sat in the dark with the horses hobbled nearby. Eleanor had the stern letter in her hands. She wasn't reading it, couldn't in the dark. She was just holding it. "My father built that land for me," she said. "He didn't have sons. He said that was fine. He said the land didn't care who held the deed as long as the person holding it was worth a damn." She paused. "His words. Sounds like a man worth knowing." "He was." Her voice was steady. "He would have liked you." Caleb said nothing. The night settled around them. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask. What made you stay on that mountain after—" She stopped. "I don't know what after. I just know the way you live up there alone for 15 years, it seems like something made you choose it." The question sat there between them in the dark. He could leave it. She hadn't pushed, hadn't demanded. She'd asked, and she was waiting, and if he stayed silent, she would accept it. He thought about Daniel Hayes, who had watched him from a distance for years and had named him the last honest man on the mountain. He thought about whether a man could earn that name and still be someone who'd never given another person a real answer in 15 years. "There was a woman," he said. "Long time ago, before the mountain, before all of this." He paused. The words were rusty from not being used. "She chose someone with more to offer. That's the short version. The long version doesn't change the end." He looked up at the stars. "I came up to that mountain to work. Figured I'd go back down when I'd worked enough of it out of my system." "And you never did." "I stopped expecting to after a while." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a long time to be alone." It was easier than the alternative. Easier than what? He looked at her. In the dark, she was just a shape, and two lighter spots that were her eyes, and she was looking at him with the directness that he'd noticed from the first moment she'd been conscious enough to look at anything. "Caring about something you could lose," he said. A silence. "You're doing it now," she said quietly. "Caring about something you could lose." He didn't answer that. She didn't push. After a moment, she said, "I'll take first watch." "Your shoulder." "My eyes work fine." She settled herself against the rock. "Sleep, Caleb. I'll wake you in 3 hours." He looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled his hat down and leaned back and closed his eyes. He didn't sleep right away. He lay there in the summer dark, listening to the horses breathe, and the night move around them, and the quiet sound of Eleanor Hayes doing exactly what she'd said, watching steady, dependable, and something he'd spent 15 years carefully dismantling, rebuilt itself one quiet increment at a time in the space behind his ribs. He thought about what waited for them in Bozeman. The federal commissioner's office, the competing claim, the stern letter, the cascade of things that would have to go right. He thought about Garrison Holt, who by now knew something had gone sideways, and who was the kind of man who responded to things going sideways by making them go worse for everyone involved. He thought about 7 families in the valley below those 2 creeks, and whether they knew yet that the water their cattle and their children depended on was sitting inside a legal fight between a dead man's deed and a rich man's lawyers. He thought about Eleanor Hayes, who had ridden to his mountain with a bullet in her shoulder and 3 words on her lips, and who had in 2 days managed to be smarter and steadier and more determined than anyone he'd met in a very long time. Some things just need doing. He'd said it to her like it was a simple thing, like it didn't cost anything. The night was warm, and the stars were clear, and tomorrow was Bozeman. He closed his eyes and let it come. They rode into Bozeman with the morning sun at their backs and dust on everything they owned. Caleb had been to Bozeman twice in the past 5 years. Once for iron stock he couldn't source closer. Once to settle a matter that hadn't needed settling the way the other party had hoped. He knew the layout well enough. The Federal Land Commission office sat on the north end of Main Street, a brick building that looked more permanent than most things in Montana, which was either reassuring or ironic, depending on your circumstances. He didn't go there first. He pulled up 3 blocks short and turned them into a side street and tied the horses at a water trough and said, "Wait." Eleanor looked at him. "What are you doing? Looking?" He scanned the street ahead from where they stood. It was morning town coming awake normal traffic for the hour. But there were 2 men sitting on the bench outside the Land Commission building who were not doing anything in particular, which was its own kind of information. "Those 2, he said quietly, "outside the commission." She looked. "Holt's men. Don't recognize them. But they're not waiting on anything official. Office doesn't open for another half hour." He watched them. One of them said something to the other without looking up. The other one laughed without turning his head. "They're watching the street." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Pollard got word to Holt faster than I thought. Or Holt had this covered independent of Pollard." He pulled back from the corner. "Holt's been planning this for months. He'd have thought about the Federal Commission. He'd have put someone here as a precaution. Which means he's not certain we're coming here. Which means they're watching and reporting, not stopping." He looked at her. "Not yet. How do we get in?" He thought about it. The front door was the obvious answer, and the obvious answer was the wrong one. But the commission building was brick on 3 sides with an alley on the 4th that ran behind a row of storefronts, and there was a back entrance he'd noticed on his first trip to Bozeman, used for deliveries and record transfers and the kind of official business that didn't need an audience. "Back alley," he said. "I go in alone. You stay with the horses." "No." He looked at her. "I'm the deed holder," she said. "I'm the one with legal standing to file a complaint. You can't go in without me." "I can tell them." "Caleb." She said his name the way she'd been saying it, flat, no argument attached, just the fact. "I need to be there. The commissioner needs to hear it from me directly. That's how federal process works." He knew she was right. He didn't like it, but he knew it. "We go together through the alley," he said. "Fast and quiet. If those men move, we don't stop. Whatever they say, whatever they do, we don't stop until we're inside that building. Understood? And if things go wrong—" "Things have been going wrong since I rode up your mountain," she said. "I'm still here." He looked at her for a second. Then he said, "Let's go." Ing. The alley was narrow and smelled of horse and heat, and they moved through it at a pace just short of running. Caleb was ahead, Eleanor a step behind and to his right, and he kept his attention split between what was in front of them and the sound of the main street behind them. They reached the back door of the commission building, and he knocked. A pause. He knocked again, harder. A bolt slid back, and the door opened on a young man in clerk's clothes, holding a ledger, and wearing the expression of someone who had not expected this particular kind of morning. "Federal Land Commission," Caleb said. "Yes, but we're not. We need to see the commissioner, right now. Federal matter, deed, dispute, evidence of fraud in a county land office." He kept his voice level and his foot in the door. "The name is Hayes, Eleanor Hayes, Gallatin County. She's the deed holder." The clerk looked at Eleanor, then back at Caleb, then at the alley behind them. "Commissioner Aldrich doesn't—" "Son?" Caleb's voice dropped a register. "There are 2 men out front of this building watching for us. They work for the man who's filing the fraudulent claim. If you send us back out that door, the only person in the territory who can testify to what we know walks back into their line of sight." He let that sit for 1 second. "Your call." The clerk made his call. He stepped back. "Yaro." Commissioner Aldrich was a man of about 60, with the kind of face that had spent decades listening to people who believed they were telling the truth and had learned to hear the difference. He was already at his desk when the clerk brought them in, and he looked at Eleanor first, then at Caleb, then at the back door through which they'd entered and said, "All right, sit down, tell me." Eleanor told him. She laid it out in sequence. The deed transfer, her father's death. The competing claim, the locked county land office. Martin Pollard's involvement, The stern letter. The discrepancy in the survey date. She was clear and precise, and she didn't embellish, and she didn't break. And Caleb sat beside her, and watched Aldrich listen, and tracked the old man's face for what it was taking in. Aldrich asked 2 questions during the telling. Both were sharp, and both were exactly the right questions. He asked about the survey date discrepancy, wanted her to repeat the specifics. And he asked about Pollard, whether she had any direct evidence of his connection to Holt's organization beyond inference. "The inference is strong," Eleanor said. "He came to my property personally to inform me the land office was locked. He was on the Helena Road when we came west. He was alone and moving fast." "Inference," Aldrich repeated. "The county registration records will show whether Pollard processed the original filing," Caleb said. "If he did, and the record has been altered, that's not inference." Aldrich looked at him. "And you are?" "Caleb Whitmore." He paused. "I'm with Miss Hayes. Are you a party to the deed dispute?" "No." "Then you're a witness." "If that's what's useful." Aldrich almost smiled. It wasn't a warm smile, but it was a real one, and it acknowledged something that Caleb figured was the man recognizing someone who wasn't there for any reason except the reason they'd stated. "The stern letter," Aldrich said. "May I see it?" Eleanor produced it. The seal was intact. She'd carried it that way through everything. She broke it now and passed it across the desk. Aldrich read it once quickly and then once more slowly, and his expression didn't change, but his posture did a slight forward shift that said his attention had engaged at a different level. "Your father's lawyer states clearly that the deed was drawn on the 14th of January, and the filing instruction was given on the 28th. He looked up. "If the county registration shows a date consistent with that, and the Gallatin Valley Land and Water Concern Survey is dated April, they've manufactured a claim on property that was already legally transferred," Eleanor said. "And they've used control of the county land office to prevent the registration date from being verified." Aldrich set the letter down. "This is a serious accusation, Miss Hayes." "Yes, sir, it is." "Against a serious man." "Yes, sir." "Garrison Holt has friends in the territorial legislature." He said it plainly, not as a threat, just as geography. "I know," Eleanor said. "That's why I came to you." The thing that happened next was not what Caleb had expected, and in his experience the unexpected was rarely convenient. The front door of the commission building opened. Not the back door they'd come through. The front door which faced Main Street, which was where the 2 watchers had been sitting. The clerk appeared in the doorway of Aldrich's office looking genuinely distressed. "Commissioner, there are men here. They're asking..." "How many?" Caleb was already on his feet. "3. One of them says he has a court order." Caleb looked at Aldrich. Aldrich looked at the clerk. "From which court?" Aldrich said. "Territorial District. He's got a judge's seal." Eleanor stood. Her face had gone still in that way he'd learned meant she was controlling something larger underneath. "They followed us," she said quietly. "Or they were already here, waiting." "Bring them in," Aldrich said to the clerk. "Commissioner," Caleb started. "I have to." Aldrich's voice was level. "A court order is a court order. If it's legitimate, I have a legal obligation. If it's not..." He picked up the stern letter and opened his desk drawer and put it inside. Then he closed the drawer. "I'm a thorough man, Mr. Whitmore. I believe in complete records." He'd put the letter away before the men walked in. Caleb understood what had just happened. He stood down. 3 men came through the door. 2 were the bench-sitters from out front. Larger up close, the look of hired durability that Holt seemed to favor. The 3rd was in a suit carrying a leather satchel, and he had the manner of a man accustomed to rooms going quiet when he entered them. "Commissioner Aldrich," he said. "Reginald Marsh. I represent the Gallatin Valley Land and Water Concern." "Mr. Marsh." Aldrich didn't stand. "You have a court order." "I do." Marsh opened the satchel and produced a folded document and set it on the desk. "A temporary injunction preventing the Federal Commission from accepting or processing any deed documentation relating to property in the Upper Gallatin Valley, pending resolution of the competing claim currently before the Territorial District Court. Aldrich picked it up, read it. The room was very quiet. Eleanor said, "That injunction was obtained without notice to me. I'm the deed holder. I have a right. You have a right to appear in Territorial District Court in Helena within 30 days, Marsh said. He looked at her with the particular neutrality of a man paid to have no personal feelings about outcomes. The injunction was granted on the basis of the pending claim. It's standard procedure. Standard procedure. Eleanor's voice was controlled, but barely. Garrison Holt manufactures a fraudulent claim, and the court grants him an injunction before the other party even knows there's a proceeding. Miss Hayes. Aldrich's voice was quiet. He looked up from the document. The injunction is valid on its face. She stared at him, which means, he continued precisely, that I cannot at this time accept or process documentation related to the Upper Gallatin property. He set the injunction down. He looked at Eleanor. However, he let the word sit. An injunction prevents me from processing documentation. It does not prevent me from conducting an inquiry into the administration of a county land office where credible allegations of record manipulation have been made. He looked at Marsh. That inquiry is a separate matter and falls under federal jurisdiction. Marsh's expression shifted by a fraction. Commissioner, if you're suggesting, I'm suggesting that the condition of the Gallatin County Land Office is a federal concern independent of any private deed dispute. Aldrich folded his hands on the desk. I'll be sending a federal inspector to Ridgefall within the week to examine the registration records in their entirety. He paused, including chain of title records for the Upper Gallatin going back 20 years. Something changed in the room, Marsh said carefully. That seems like an overreach. You're welcome to take it up with the territorial governor. Aldrich's tone had not changed by 1 degree. He and I have discussed the state of county land administration before. I imagine he'd find the conversation interesting. One of the two men in the back, the bigger one, took a half-step forward. Just 1 step. Just enough to be noticed. Caleb was between him and Aldrich's desk before the step finished. He didn't reach for anything. Didn't say anything. Just stood there in the space the man had been moving toward all 6 feet 2 of him, and looked at the man with the particular steadiness of someone who has made a decision and is done reconsidering it. The man stopped. Marsh said, "We're done here." He picked up the injunction. Commissioner, Miss Hayes. He looked at Caleb. Mr. Whitmore, Caleb said. Marsh looked at him for 1 second with the expression of a man filing something in a mental cabinet he intended to open later. Then he turned and left, and his 2 associates went with him. The door closed. Aldrich exhaled, opened his desk drawer, put the stern letter back on his desk and looked at it. That injunction is going to complicate things, he said. Can your inquiry override it? Eleanor asked. My inquiry can compel the county land office to produce records, if those records show the filing date your father's lawyer states. He tapped the letter. The injunction becomes moot. A fraudulently obtained injunction is no injunction at all. He looked at her. But it takes time. How much time? The inspector I send to Ridgefall will need a week to get there and conduct the examination. Another week to report back. The district court in Helena will want to respond to a federal inquiry before continuing their proceedings. He paused. 3 weeks. Possibly 4. In 3 weeks, Eleanor stopped. Caleb said it for her. In 3 weeks, Holt can do considerable damage to a property without a legal owner in residence. Aldrich looked at him. Is there no one who could maintain presence on the land during the inquiry? It's her land, Caleb said. She's here. If she returns to the property while the injunction is active, the injunction prevents you from processing documentation, Caleb said. It doesn't prevent a deed holder from residing on her own property. Aldrich considered that. Technically correct. Then that's what she does. He looked at Eleanor. She was already ahead of him. He could see it in her face, the calculation already running. You go back to your land. You stay on it. Holt can't legally remove you while the federal inquiry is active because removing you would constitute interference with a federal proceeding. He'll try anyway, Eleanor said. Holt doesn't wait on legal proceedings. I know. Caleb looked at Aldrich. How fast can you get your inspector moving? 2 days to prepare the commission order. He'd leave Friday. Friday. Caleb did the math. If we leave today and ride hard, we can be back in Ridgefall by Thursday. And then, Eleanor said, and then you're on your land with a federal inquiry in motion and a deed that's going to be confirmed by the registration records the moment the inspector gets there. He met her eyes. Holt moves on you while that's happening. He's not just after your land anymore. He's interfering with federal process. Different category of problem for him. She looked at him steadily. You've thought about this. Riding gives a man time to think. Caleb? She took a step toward him. If we go back to Ridgefall, Holt won't wait. He'll come at us immediately, with more men than last time. I know. And you're one man. I know that too. She was looking at him with something that was past calculation and past strategy, something more direct than that, something that lived in a different part of a person. Why? She said. You could leave, right now. Holt's quarrel is with me and the land. If you walked away, you'd be clear of it. I gave you 2 hours of sleep and told you to be ready to ride at first light, he said. That was the commitment. That was practical. Eleanor. He said her name the way she'd been saying his flat, no decoration, just the word. I watched Holt's men push out the Coltons 11 years ago, and I turned down the bribe and I counted that as doing what I could. I told myself I'd done enough. He paused. I didn't do enough. The Coltons still lost their land. He held her gaze. I'm not making that call again. The silence in Aldrich's office was the kind that contains too much to be comfortable. Eleanor said, There's something else you should know. Something in her tone shifted, and he went still. What? He said. She glanced at Aldrich. The commissioner quietly gathered a set of papers from his desk and moved toward the outer office with the tact of a man who understood when a room needed privacy. When the door closed, Eleanor said, My father's letter. The one he left with Stern. She paused. There's a second part I didn't show you. Caleb waited. The property deed covers 80 acres. That's what's on record. She met his eyes. But my father found something on the land 2 years before he died, up on the high north face above the second creek. Another pause shorter. Silver. Everything in the room rearranged itself. How much? He said. Enough that he had it quietly assessed by a mining engineer from Virginia City. The report says... She stopped. Started again. The report says the vein could yield significant tonnage over a sustained extraction. My father didn't register the mineral rights separately. Under territorial law, they transfer with the land deed. Caleb looked at her. Holt knows. I think so. I think that's why this accelerated when it did. Water rights are worth controlling. Water rights plus a silver vein. She didn't finish the sentence. That changes everything, he said. It changes why Holt wants it that badly. Her voice was steady. It doesn't change whether the deed is valid. It doesn't change what's right. No, he said. It changes how far he'll go. Yes. She held his eyes. I needed you to know before we rode back. Caleb stood there with this new information and let it settle into the shape of what was already there. Silver changed the stakes geometrically. It meant Holt's lawyers would fight harder. His men would be less careful. His willingness to let legal proceedings run their course would be reduced to near zero. It meant the federal inquiry was more important, not less. If Holt took that property by force, the silver would be gone before any court could rule on it. Does Aldrich know? He said. No. He needs to. He moved toward the outer office door. Mineral rights transfer with the deed. If the federal inquiry is about land fraud, it needs to include the full value of what's being fraudulently claimed. If we tell Aldrich about the silver, Holt will know we told him eventually, yes. He looked at her. But Aldrich compels those records a lot faster when he understands the full extent of what's at stake. Eleanor thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. Tell him, she said.
My man.
They left Bozeman 2 hours later, with a written confirmation of the pending federal inquiry and Aldrich's personal assurance that the inspector would be on the road by Friday. Aldrich had received the information about the mineral rights with the same contained, precise attention he'd given everything else, and then he'd sent a telegraph wire to the territorial governor's office that Caleb had watched him write, and which had been 4 sentences long and very specific. On the street, the 2 men from the bench were gone. Marsh was gone. Caleb didn't find that reassuring. They're on the road ahead of us, he said. Reporting to Holt, or setting up along the route. Eleanor looked at the horses, then at him. Same back way we came. Holt knows that route now. We took too long in Bozeman. He thought fast. There's a stage road that runs southeast, cuts through the valley. Busier. More witnesses. Witnesses didn't stop them from shooting me the first time. Shooting a woman alone on her own property is different from shooting 2 people on a public stage road with a federal inquiry active. He met her eyes. Holt's crooked, not stupid. He spent years being careful. He won't throw that away unless he's cornered. And if he decides he's cornered, Caleb put his boot in the stirrup. Then we deal with it, he said. Get on your horse. They made 40 miles before the trouble found them. It came in the form of a rider who pulled up alongside them on the stage road about 3 hours out of Bozeman, a single man, which was not immediately threatening, except that he didn't pass them at a natural pace. He matched their speed, stayed 50 yards back. Caleb tracked him in the edges of his attention for a mile without reacting. He's been there since that last junction, Eleanor said quietly. Yes, not gaining, not falling back. He's a marker, Caleb said, holding our position for someone else. She understood that immediately. Someone in front of us. Or coming from the side. There's a ridgeline about 2 miles up that runs parallel to this road. He kept his voice low and his face forward. If I were setting this up, I'd have the man behind us to confirm position and 2 men on that ridge with a good angle on the road. A good angle for what? Stopping us. He paused. Permanently. He said it without drama, and she received it the same way, because at some point over the past 3 days, they had both moved past the kind of fear that required softening. Options, she said. We can run, but if they've got the ridge position, they may have the far end of the road covered too, he thought. There's a ranch a half-mile east, family named Cowboy. I don't know them, but they're here, which means they're not Holt's people. Holt's operation is north and west. You want to go to strangers. I want to not be on an open road when whoever's on that ridge decides to act. He glanced at her. One more time, can you ride hard? One more time, she said. Yes. East cutoff is coming up on the right. When I say go, don't look back. She moved her hand to the gray's neck. Subtle. Ready. He counted the yards. Go, he said. They left the stage road at a gallop, and the rider behind them reacted exactly as expected. Shouting, then the sound of pursuit, and then from the ridge the sound he'd been dreading, 2 rifle shots in fast succession that hit nothing, but hit close enough to confirm everything he'd calculated. Eleanor rode without flinching. He was half a length ahead, and he took them off the open ground toward the scrub timber that ran between the road and the Cowboy property, and the trees closed in around them, and the angle from the ridge went away. The pursuit rider was still coming. Caleb pulled up inside the tree line, spun his horse, and drew his rifle, and fired 1 shot above the pursuit rider's head when he came into the timber edge. The man pulled up hard. Caleb called out, I've got a federal document in my saddlebag, and 2 rounds left in this rifle, and I am a man who does not miss. You can tell your employer I said so. A long pause. The rider turned his horse and went back to the road. Eleanor was breathing fast beside him, controlled breathing, the kind that comes from managing something large. She looked at him and said, "You've got more than 2 rounds." "He doesn't know that." "You fired at a man." "Over a man," he said. "Different." She looked at him steadily for a moment. Something moved in her face. Not quite relief, not quite fear. Something more complicated than both. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes." She said it quick, and then again slower, like she was confirming it to herself. "Yes, I'm all right." Callaway Ranch is another quarter-mile through these trees. We ride for it, we ask to rest the horses, and we wait an hour to see if they reset on the road. And if they do, then we find another way. He looked at her. There's always another way. The Callaway Ranch was run by a man named Frank Callaway and his wife Dottie, who opened the door to find 2 road-dusty, hard-ridden people, and the particular expression on their faces that experienced ranch people recognize as serious. Frank Callaway asked one question. "You running from someone?" "Yes," Caleb said. "Law?" "No." Frank looked at Eleanor's bandaged shoulder, and at Caleb's rifle, and at the 2 horses that had been pushed hard, and then he said, "Water trough's out back. Come in when you're done." Dottie Callaway made coffee and put biscuits on the table and did not ask questions, which Caleb had found was the most useful thing a person could do in circumstances like these. While Eleanor rested, and Frank and Caleb sat at the table, Frank said, "Those shots we heard, ridge to the west." "Yes, Holt's men." Caleb looked at him. "You know him?" "Everyone in this valley knows of him." Frank wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "Lost 2 neighbors to his land companies last year. 3rd one's holding on, but barely." He looked at Caleb steadily. "What's your business with him?" Caleb told him the short version. Frank listened without interrupting. When it was done, Frank was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that Caleb hadn't expected. "My brother-in-law was the filing clerk at the Gallatin County Land Office," he said. "Before Pollard. They pushed him out 14 months ago. Found errors in his record-keeping that he swears he never made." Frank's jaw tightened. He lost his position, his reputation. He's been saying for a year that someone altered records on his watch and blamed him for it. Caleb went completely still. "What's his name?" he said. "Peters. James Peters. He's in Ridgefall." Peters could testify to the federal inspector about the record alterations. If he's willing. Frank met his eyes. He's been scared. Holt's people made it clear what happened to people who talked about it. "A federal inquiry changes that calculus," Caleb said. "If he testifies to a federal inspector, Holt can't touch him without making it significantly worse for himself." Frank looked at him for a long moment. "You believe that? I believe it's more true than not. And I believe it's the kind of chance that only comes around once." Caleb held the man's gaze. "If Holt gets those water rights, and that land, Peters never gets his name back. The families Holt already pushed out never get anything back." Silence in the Callaway kitchen, the coffee cooling in the cups. Then Frank stood up. "I'll ride to Ridgefall myself, talk to James." He looked at Caleb. "You heading back there?" "Today. I'll be there before you, going by the East Road." He reached for his hat. "If James is willing to talk, you'll find him at the church. Reverend Moss keeps a fair house." They left the Callaway Ranch an hour later, taking the East Road as Frank had said, and the stage road was quiet. When they rejoined it, whatever setup had been on the ridge had been pulled back, either because they'd abandoned the direct attempt or because they were regrouping. Eleanor rode beside him, and they moved at a steadier pace. Now the horses recovered the worst of the day behind them. She said, "Peters." "One more piece," he said. "If he talks." The federal inspector, the Stern letter, the survey date discrepancy, and a former filing clerk who can testify to record alteration. She was quiet for a moment. "My father built that case." "He built the foundation," Caleb said. "You're the one who rode to my mountain. You're the one who didn't turn us away." He didn't respond to that directly. He looked at the road ahead, the afternoon light going long and gold ridgefall somewhere in the hours ahead of them. "When we get back," he said, "you stay on your land. Your legal right to be there is your strongest position." And Holt? Holt is going to make a move. He's going to calculate that the federal inquiry gives him a limited window before everything closes on him, and he's going to act in that window. He paused. "When he does, we need to be ready." "Ready how?" "I need to talk to some people in Ridgefall." He kept his eyes on the road. "There are men there who've been waiting a long time for something to push against. Holt's taken from enough families in that valley." He glanced at her. "People don't move until they believe moving is possible. The federal inquiry makes it possible. You're going to organize them." "I'm going to talk to them." He let a beat go. Organizing is what happens when people decide the moment's right. She was quiet for a moment. "Caleb." He looked at her. "What happened to you, the woman you mentioned, the reason you came to the mountain?" She stopped, started again. "I'm not asking about that. I'm asking something else." She met his eyes. "After this is over, when the inquiry is done and the deed is confirmed and Holt's case falls apart." She held his gaze steadily. "What do you do then?" The question sat in the afternoon air between them, unhurried, and she wasn't looking away. He thought about the forge on his mountain, and Tom Briggs's axle piece half finished on the anvil, and the 15 years of mornings he'd risen before light, with no one waiting, and no one to tell him what the day was going to be. He thought about the way she'd said his name that first time in the cabin, Caleb testing its weight, and how after 3 days it had stopped sounding like a test. "I reckon I figure that out," he said when we get there. Something in her face shifted. Not quite a smile, not quite the thing beyond a smile, but somewhere in that territory. "That's the most optimistic thing you've said since I fell off my horse onto your road," she said. "Don't push your luck," he said. She laughed. It was a short sound, real and sudden, like something she hadn't planned on, and it went through him like a key in a lock he'd forgotten had a keyhole. He looked back at the road. Ridgefall was ahead of them, and Garrison Holt was already there waiting in the way that powerful men wait not patiently, but with the certainty of someone who has never yet lost what he decided to take. He was about to learn something new. They rode into Ridgefall at dusk, not down the main street. Caleb took them in through the backside of town, past the livery and the feed store and the narrow alley behind the church, the same way he'd learned to move through places where someone might be watching for you. Quiet, purposeful, without announcement. Reverend Moss was in his church when they knocked. He was a lean man in his 60s who had seen enough of human nature to be unsurprised by most things, and when he opened the door and found Caleb Whitmore and a woman with a bandaged shoulder standing in his back doorway, he said, "Come in," and asked nothing else. Frank Calloway was already there. He was sitting in the second pew with a man Caleb didn't recognize, thin mid-40s, the particular look of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a long time, and has started to show the weight of it in his face and his posture, and the careful way he held his hands. "James Peters," Frank said. Peters stood. He looked at Eleanor first, then at Caleb, and then he said, "You're the ones going up against Holt." "We're the ones with the federal inquiry in motion," Caleb said. "There's a difference." Peters absorbed that. He sat back down. Then he said, "I processed the Hayes deed filing myself. January 28th. Daniel Hayes came in on a Tuesday morning, deed in hand, witnesses listed everything in proper order. I recorded it myself. Filed the entry in the registration ledger under Gallatin County Parcel Records Upper Valley section." He paused. 2 weeks later, the entry was gone. The church went quiet. Eleanor said, "Gone." Page was altered. The entry for the Hayes filing was there on the Monday. By the following Wednesday, when Pollard asked me to pull the Upper Valley records for a routine review, it wasn't there anymore. Peter's voice was steady, but it cost him. "I told Pollard. He told me I'd made an error. Said I'd confused the filing with another parcel. But I know what I recorded." His jaw set. "I know my own work." "And then they dismissed you," Caleb said. 3 weeks later, misconduct in record keeping. The bitterness in it was old and cold. I've been in Ridgefall since with no position and no way to prove what I know without a copy of the original entry. He looked at Caleb. Which doesn't exist anymore, because Pollard destroyed it. Caleb looked at Eleanor. She was looking at Peters with the expression of a person who has just received confirmation of something they already knew, and the confirmation is worse than the suspicion because it makes it real. "You'd testify to this," she said. "To a federal inspector. I've been waiting a year for someone to ask me that question." Peters met her eyes. "Yes, I'll testify." Reverend Moss, who had been standing at the back of the church with his hands folded and his face composed, said quietly, "There's something else." Everyone looked at him. "Martin Pollard came to see me this afternoon," he said, "before you arrived. He asked me whether I'd had any unusual visitors." He paused. "I told him I hadn't." "He's tracking us," Eleanor said. "He's tracking you," Moss corrected. "Specifically, you, Miss Hayes, and he was not alone. There were 2 men with him outside." He looked at Caleb. "Garrison Holt arrived in Ridgefall this morning." The weight of that landed in the room. Holt himself. Not his lawyers, not his hired men. The man. Caleb said, "Where is he?" "The Grand Hotel. He took the 2 best rooms." Moss's tone carried the precise neutrality of a man of faith describing something faithless. "He's been meeting with people all day. Town council. The sheriff." A pause. "Judge Harlan." Judge Harlan was the Ridgefall Justice of the Peace, a man of flexible convictions who Caleb had always found to be whichever way the wind was blowing. "He's building local authority," Caleb said, "getting the town aligned before the federal inspector arrives." "How long do we have?" Eleanor asked. "Federal inspector leaves Bozeman Friday. Gets here Tuesday at earliest." He looked at the room. 4 days. "Holt won't wait 4 days," Peters said. "That's not how he operates." "No," Caleb agreed. "He won't." He looked at Eleanor and she looked at him, and the same understanding passed between them without words. The understanding that everything they'd done in Bozeman, the inquiry, the commissioner, the Stern letter, and the survey discrepancy, all of it was going to mean nothing if Holt moved on the property before the inspector arrived and the legal machinery caught up. "I need to go to my land," Eleanor said. "I know. Tonight. I know." He turned to Moss. "Reverend, is there anyone in this town who would ride with us?" Moss looked at him. "Ride with you?" "Out to the Hayes property. Tonight." He kept his voice level. "Eleanor's legal right to be on that land is solid, but Holt's going to send men and 2 people against however many he brings is a different kind of math than 2 people with witnesses present." Moss was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Let me make some visits." Kid. What Caleb hadn't counted on, what he'd underestimated after 15 years of living above a town he'd assumed had forgotten how to stand up for anything, was how many people had been waiting. Moss went out for 2 hours. He came back with 9 men. Not gunfighters. Not hired hands. Ranchers and a blacksmith from the south end of town. And a former Army corporal named Dix, who ran the feed store. And Tom Briggs, who was there with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that said he understood exactly what he'd come for. Tom said, "You fixed my axle. Figured I owed you something." Caleb looked at him. "You don't owe me anything, Tom." "I know." Tom put his hat on. "That's why I'm here." They rode out to the Hayes property, under a summer night sky, with the moon high and the road pale beneath them. 11 people moving together in the quiet way of people who understand what they've committed to. Eleanor rode beside Caleb, and he could feel the quality of her silence, not the silence of fear, but the silence of someone absorbing something that has moved them and hasn't finished moving. "You told me no one in Ridgefall would cross the street for you," she said. "I believe that." "You were wrong." "Appears so." She was quiet for a moment. "My father would have said that's what happens when you spend too long alone on a mountain. You forget that other people can surprise you." Your father was probably right. He usually was. She paused. It annoyed me considerably. Caleb almost smiled. It was a near thing. The Hayes property sat at the end of a half-mile track that climbed from the valley floor toward the high ground where the creeks ran. The cabin was dark. When they arrived, Eleanor hadn't been there in 4 days, and Caleb went through it first before he let anyone else in, rifle up, moving room to room. Empty, untouched, which was either because Holt hadn't sent anyone yet or because he'd been watching and waiting and wanted them on the property before he acted. Caleb didn't share that calculation with Eleanor. He assessed the building and the approaches and placed his 9 volunteer riders where they'd do the most good dicks and 2 others on the high ground. Above the north approach, Tom Briggs and a rancher named Carver on the east track, the rest positioned to cover the cabin from 3 sides. He came back in to find Eleanor at the table with a lamp and a piece of paper writing. "What are you doing?" he said. "Writing a statement. Everything I know in sequence with dates signed and witnessed." She didn't look up. "If something happens to me before the inspector arrives, there's a written record." He sat down across from her. "Nothing is going to happen to you," he said. She looked up. "You've said that before." "I keep meaning it." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the paper. "Help me with the dates. You have a better memory for the sequence than I do." They worked through it together for an hour. Caleb supplying the timeline where she was uncertain. Eleanor writing in a clear, precise hand that told him she'd had real schooling at some point. When it was done, she signed it, and Caleb signed it as witness, and she folded it and put it with the deed and the stern letter in a cloth pouch that she placed in the false bottom of the chest in the bedroom, a hiding place Caleb found by accident, and she confirmed without embarrassment. "My father built it," she said. "He believed in redundancy. Smart man. He said the only document that couldn't be destroyed was one that existed in multiple places." She closed the chest. "You have the commissioner's written inquiry notice in your saddlebag. Peters has his testimony. I have these." She straightened. "Even if Holt takes everything else, he can't take all of it." Caleb looked at her. Standing there in the lamplight of her father's cabin with her chin level and her shoulder bandaged and 4 days of hard riding behind her, she looked like the kind of person who had always existed at the edge of what was possible and had simply decided to keep walking. He thought about what she'd asked him on the road. "After this is over, what do you do then?" He hadn't answered her fully. He still didn't have a full answer, but something in him was becoming aware that the shape of the question was changing. He was about to say something, he wasn't sure exactly what, but it was forming when Dix's voice came from outside. "Riders coming. North approach. 6 of them." Caleb was out the door and moving before the sentence finished. 6 riders. North approach was the high ground above the creek, the direction that gave the best view down onto the cabin. Whoever was leading them knew the property. He came up beside Dix in the darkness above the tree line. "Count again," he said. 6. Moving slow. "They know we're here. They know someone's here." He tracked the movement in the dark. "They don't know how many." From behind him, Eleanor said, "I told you to stay inside." "You told me nothing," she said, and she had the spare rifle, and she was positioned 3 feet to his left, with the same steadiness she'd had in his doorway 4 days ago. He looked at her. She looked at the riders. "All right," he said. The 6 riders came to a stop about 100 yards out from the tree line. One of them, the one in front, larger than the others on a dark horse, held up a hand, and the group halted. A voice called out, "Caleb Whitmore." He didn't recognize the voice, but the way it carried, assured the voice of a man accustomed to being heard, told him something. "Who's asking?" he called back. "My name is Harlan Webb. I work directly for Garrison Holt." A pause. "Mr. Holt has an offer. At 10 o'clock at night. Mr. Holt doesn't keep conventional hours." Webb urged his horse forward 2 steps. "Just 2 careful, not aggressive. a man who understood the value of not provoking the unknown quantity. He'd like to resolve this without further difficulty. Funny way to avoid difficulty, riding up on a woman's property in the dark with 5 men behind you. Another pause, longer this time. Webb was recalibrating. Mr. Holt is prepared to offer Eleanor Hayes $3,000 for the deed to this property. Clear title transfer, immediate payment, and his word that no further action will be taken against either her or another pause, anyone associated with her. $3,000. Caleb heard Eleanor make a sound beside him. Not a sound of temptation, a sound of something else. The sound of a person confronted with the full measure of how much what they're defending is worth to the other side. He said, "Miss Hayes doesn't want to sell." Mr. Holt believes that with more information, Mr. Holt can take his offer and his 5 men and ride back down to the Grand Hotel. His voice was level and entirely without heat, which was more effective than anger. The Federal Land Commission has an inquiry active on this property. That inquiry is going to reach Ridgefall on Tuesday. Any action taken against this deed holder between now and then becomes part of that inquiry. He let it sit. Tell Holt that. A very long silence. Webb said, 3,000 is a generous? Tell him. The riders sat in the dark for 15 seconds. Then Webb turned his horse without another word, and the 6 of them went back the way they came, and the night absorbed them. Dix exhaled somewhere to Caleb's right. Eleanor stood absolutely still beside him until the sound of hooves faded. Then she said, $3,000. Yes. That's more money than my father made in 10 years on this land. Yes. Which tells you exactly how much the silver vein is worth. Yes. He looked at her. You didn't waver. She looked back at him. Did you think I would? No, he said. I didn't. They stood there in the summer dark a moment longer, and then she lowered the rifle and turned toward the cabin, and he followed. And behind them, Dix and the others settled back into their positions, with the quiet competence of men who had committed to a thing and intended to see it through. The next morning brought something Caleb hadn't predicted. Garrison Holt came himself. Not with 6 men, not with his lawyer or his hired muscle. He rode up to the Hayes property at 9 in the morning on a gray thoroughbred that cost more than most men in Ridgefall would earn in 5 years, and he came alone, and he stopped in the yard and waited. Caleb watched him from the window before going out. He'd formed a picture of Holt over the years from second-hand description and reputation, and the man in the yard was and wasn't what he'd expected. He was in his 50s, well-dressed in the way that suggested money that predated the West. Not large, medium-height, compact, but with the quality of absolute stillness that belongs to people who have spent long enough getting what they want that they've stopped being in any hurry. Caleb went outside. He stood in the yard 10 feet from Holt's horse and looked up at the man and said nothing. Holt looked down at him, a long, assessing look. "You're Whitmore," he said. "You're Holt." A pause. "I tried to buy your land once, 11 years ago." "I remember. You turned me down for considerably less money than I've offered for this property." He tilted his head slightly. "I've always respected that in a strange way. A man who knows what he won't do. Then you know I won't be bought now either." "I know." He looked at the cabin behind Caleb, then back at him. "I didn't come to buy you." He paused. "I came to tell you something. One man to another without lawyers, and without my people listening." Caleb waited. "I've sent 2 telegraphs to Helena this morning," Holt said. "One to the Territorial Land Commissioner, one to a judge on the district court. By this afternoon, there will be 3 lawyers in Ridgefall, and by Wednesday, there will be a competing federal inquiry challenging Aldrich's authority to conduct an examination of county records." He said it without heat, the way a man states geographic facts. "I have resources you don't. I have time and money and lawyers, and I can do this for 2 years if I need to." He looked at Caleb steadily. "The question I'm asking you man to man is whether that outcome serves anyone. You're asking me to convince Eleanor Hayes to take your offer. I'm asking you to consider whether she wins anything by refusing it." He leaned forward slightly on the saddle. $3,000 is real. This legal fight she's starting is going to cost her everything she has before it's half done. Whatever she believes about the deed. The deed is valid, Caleb said. Your survey is fraudulent. Pollard altered the registration record and you know it. Holt didn't flinch. You can't prove that. James Peters can. He watched something move behind Holt's eyes. The man you had pushed out of the land office a year ago. He processed the Hayes filing himself. He'll testify to the federal inspector, and he'll testify in any territorial court you want to put him in. He kept his voice steady. You altered evidence, used a corrupted land official to erase a valid filing, filed a fraudulent competing claim, and you had a woman shot on her own property. He paused. That's not a land dispute anymore. That's criminal conduct in front of a federal inquiry. A silence. Garrison Holt sat on his gray thoroughbred in the morning light and looked at Caleb Whitmore, and for the first time in the conversation, something shifted in the controlled stillness of his face. Not fear men like Holt didn't fear quickly, but calculation. The recalculation of a man who has just received new information and is running it against his plans at speed. He said, Peters would need to prove his testimony is credible. He kept a private journal, Caleb said. This was a gamble. Peters hadn't mentioned a journal. But the way Holt's expression shifted confirmed it before the man could control the response. You didn't know about that. I don't know what you think. You thought when you pushed him out and discredited him that you'd close that door. Caleb kept his eyes on Holt's face. You didn't close it. You just locked it from the outside, and now it's open. The silence stretched. Holt straightened in the saddle. He looked past Caleb at the cabin and at the high ground above the North Creek where Dix was visible if you knew to look, and he did the count. A man of his experience always did the count. He said, This doesn't end the way you think it does, Whitmore. Maybe not, Caleb said. But it doesn't end the way you planned either. Holt looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and rode back down the track without another word. Caleb went back inside, and Eleanor was at the table, and she said immediately, I heard most of it. I know you did. Peters has a journal. I don't know. He sat down. But Holt believed it, which means either Peters actually has one, or Holt has enough doubt about what Peters might have kept that the possibility is enough. He met her eyes. We need to talk to Peters today. If Holt's going to challenge the federal inquiry, he can challenge it all he wants from Helena. The inspector is still coming, and Peters' testimony is still valid, and the Stern letter is still in Aldrich's desk. He looked at her steadily. Holt came here himself this morning. That's not what a man does when he's confident. That's what a man does when he's running out of moves and wants to see what he's dealing with. She absorbed that. And what is he dealing with? More than he expected. She looked at him across the table with those gray eyes, and something in the morning light caught her face in a way that made him aware of the exhaustion in it. 4 days of hard riding and fear, and the particular kind of strength that costs more than it lets on. He said, When did you last sleep? I slept. 2 hours in a chair doesn't count. I'm fine. Eleanor. He said her name the way she'd taught him to say it flat, no argument, just the fact. You've been running on Will for 4 days. The inspector isn't here until Tuesday. You have today and tonight and most of tomorrow before anything else requires your direct action. He held her gaze. Sleep. She looked at him. Who watches the property? She said. I do. Dix and the others do. You need sleep too. I'll sleep after you do. A pause. She was assessing him the way she'd assessed him that first morning, the same process, the same gray eyes, reading something behind the surface. You're not going to let this go, she said. No. You're going to sit in that chair with your rifle and watch the road. Yes. That's... She stopped, started again. That's the most stubborn thing I've ever witnessed. You grew up ranching, he said. That can't be true. She looked at him for a second. Then something broke loose in her face. Not the almost smile he'd seen before, but the real thing sudden and unguarded, and it transformed her in a way that hit him somewhere between the chest and the throat. "Go to sleep, Eleanor," he said. She stood, moved toward the bedroom, stopped at the doorway. "Caleb?" He looked up. "My father chose well," she said, "sending me to you." He didn't have an answer for that. She didn't wait for one. The bedroom door closed. He settled in the chair with his rifle and looked out the window at the morning and thought about Garrison Holt riding back down toward town and what the man was going to do next and how much time they actually had. But underneath all of that running quiet, like the creek sound that he could just barely hear from where he sat, was the sound of Eleanor Hayes saying, "My father chose well," and what it felt like to be the thing a dead man had trusted as the right choice. He sat with that for a while. Peters had a journal. Frank Calloway confirmed it that afternoon when he rode out to the property. Peters had kept a personal record of his work at the land office going back 6 years. The habit of a meticulous man who'd never had reason to think the habit would matter, and then suddenly had every reason. The journal had the Hayes filing recorded on the correct date in Peters' own hand, with notations about the witnesses and the condition of the deed document. It didn't match the altered county record. It was the discrepancy in physical form in ink that was 18 months old. "Why didn't he come forward with this sooner?" Eleanor asked. Frank looked at his hands. "Because Holt's men came to his house 2 weeks after he was dismissed. Didn't hurt him. Just..." He paused. "Told him what would happen if he made trouble. His wife. His daughter." He met Eleanor's eyes. "He's been afraid since then." "He was willing to testify last night," Caleb said. "He's more willing when he's not alone." Frank looked at him directly. When someone else is standing first. Caleb thought about that. About the people who were able to move when they could see someone else had already moved. About the difference between cowardice and reasonable fear, and how thin that line was when you had a family to protect. "Bring Peters out here," he said. "Tonight. He stays with us until the inspector arrives." He looked at Eleanor. "Federal inquiry protection applies to witnesses. Holt touches Peters while the inquiry is active, it's obstruction." "Holt tried to buy me off this morning," Eleanor said. "He's not going to accept that every piece is moving against him." "No," Caleb agreed. "He's not." It came 3 hours before sunset. Not Webb this time. Not 6 riders. 12 coming down the main track in the open, and at the front of them was a man Caleb recognized with a sinking recognition, the Ridgefall sheriff man named Cole, who had managed to be uninvolved in everything of significance in this town for 8 straight years. He was wearing his badge and holding a piece of paper. Caleb stepped into the yard. Cole pulled up. He had the look of a man profoundly uncomfortable with his current assignment and not willing to admit it. "Whitmore," he said. "Sheriff?" "I've got a court order." He held up the paper. "Signed by Judge Harlan, ordering the removal of all persons from this property pending resolution of the competing deed claim." Eleanor was beside Caleb before he could move. She stepped forward and took the paper from Cole's hand before he quite knew what was happening. She read it. 30 seconds of absolute silence. Then she said, "Judge Harlan doesn't have jurisdiction to issue this order." Cole blinked. He's the Ridgefall Justice of the Peace. His jurisdiction is civil matters within the Ridgefall town limits." She held the paper up. "This property is outside the town limits. County jurisdiction. The county judge is in Helena." She looked at Cole directly. "This order is invalid on its face." Cole's jaw worked. Behind him, 11 riders who were not Cole's regular deputies were very still. Furthermore, she continued, and her voice was something Caleb had not heard from her before. Not louder, but with a quality of absolute precision that made every word land like struck iron. "A federal land commission inquiry is active on this property as of yesterday. Any attempt to remove the deed holder from this property, while that inquiry is in process, constitutes interference with a federal proceeding." She lowered the paper. "Which is a federal crime, Sheriff, not a territorial one." "Federal." Cole looked at her, then at Caleb. then at the paper in her hand. "I'm just doing what I was—" "I know," Eleanor said, and the edge came out of her voice, leaving something that was closer to compassion than condemnation. "I know you are, and I understand that the man who gave you this order has considerable influence in this town." She paused. "But you are the law in Ridgefall Sheriff, not Garrison Holt. And when the federal inspector arrives on Tuesday, you're going to need to be on the correct side of what he finds." A very long silence. Caleb watched Cole. The man was fighting something internal that was visible in the line of his shoulders and the way his hands shifted on his reins. 8 years of looking the other way was a heavy habit, and habits didn't break in a single moment. But sometimes they cracked. Cole said to the riders behind him, "We're going back to town." One of the riders, the big one Webb's build, not a local deputy, said, "Sheriff, we have an order." "The lady says the order's not valid," Cole said flatly. "I'm not a lawyer. I'm going to go talk to a lawyer." He looked at Eleanor one more time. Something in his face acknowledged her in a way that didn't require words. Then he turned his horse and the Ridgefall sheriff rode back down the track, and 2 of his regular deputies went with him, and after a tense moment, the other 9 riders followed. Eleanor let out a breath. Caleb looked at her. "Where did you learn property jurisdiction law?" he said. "My father's bookshelf." The ghost of the real smile. He had 3 legal references and no fiction. I read what was available. "Daniel Hayes," Caleb said. "I'm sorry I never met him." She looked at him, and the smile shifted into something quieter and more permanent. "He would have liked you," she said again. Different emphasis than the first time she'd said it. Something additional in it now. He didn't look away, and then Tom Briggs's voice came from the tree line. "There's one rider east track, coming fast." The rider was Frank Calloway, and he was moving at a pace that said the message couldn't wait. He pulled up in the yard and was off his horse before it stopped properly. "Peters," he said. "They went to his house. An hour ago. He got out, he's at the church with Reverend Moss, but they took the journal." The word hit the yard like a dropped weight. Eleanor said, "Holt has the journal." "His men have it." Frank was catching his breath. "Peters got out with his wife and daughter. They're safe. But the journal is gone," Caleb said. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences before it. This one had edges. The journal was the clearest physical evidence the contemporaneous record in Peters' own hand dated and detailed the thing that made testimony into proof. Without it, they had Peters's word. The Stern letter, the survey date discrepancy, and the circumstantial timeline. It was strong, but it was not the same as the journal. He watched Eleanor process it. He could see her doing it the same rapid internal accounting he'd watched her run on the ridge trail in the commissioner's office in Holt's lawyer's face, running the variables, finding the shape. She said, "Peters memorized it." Everyone looked at her. "A meticulous man who kept a detailed journal for 6 years," she said. "He wouldn't have kept it only in writing. The specific entries would be committed." She looked at Frank. "Ask him. Ask him to write down everything he remembers from the Hayes filing entry. Date, time, witnesses, deed, condition, every notation he made." She turned to Caleb. "It's not the physical book, but a sworn statement from Peters reproducing the content from memory, corroborated by the Stern letter and the survey discrepancy that's still a pattern. A federal inspector looks for patterns." Caleb looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Frank, get Peters, tonight." Frank was back on his horse before the sentence ended. Caleb turned to Eleanor, and she was already looking at him, and in that look was something that had been building since a gray mare had come down a mountain road, carrying a woman with 3 words on her lips, building through every mile of hard road and every decision point, and every moment when one of them had looked at the other and found something dependable. "We're going to make it," she said. Not a question. "We're going to make it," he said. He meant it the way he'd meant the other things he'd said since she'd arrived on his mountain, not as reassurance, but as fact. The way a man states what he knows when he knows it all the way down. She held his gaze. Outside, the summer evening was coming down, and somewhere in Ridgefall Garrison, Holt was holding a journal he'd believed would close the last door, and he was about to discover that the door had already moved, and Tuesday was coming. Peters arrived at the Hayes property before full dark with his wife and daughter, and the look of a man who had stopped running and decided to stand still. Frank Calloway brought them in through the east track, and Reverend Moss came with them, and by the time they were all inside the cabin, it was crowded in the way that places get when people have gathered for something that matters. Eleanor put coffee on without being asked, and nobody spoke much while it heated because there was a particular kind of silence that belongs to people who have made a decision together and are waiting on what comes next. Peters sat at the table with paper and a pen that Eleanor produced from the chest in the bedroom, and he wrote. He wrote for 2 hours. He didn't pause to think that was what told Caleb the most. A man reconstructing something uncertain pauses, backtracks, corrects himself. Peters wrote in one continuous motion, line after line, the handwriting of someone transcribing from something internal that was fully formed and had been waiting to come out. The Hayes filing entry, the date, the time of day, the condition of the deed document, the names of both witnesses, and the county seal notation. Every detail he'd recorded in the journal reproduced from a memory that had been living with the material for 18 months. When he finished, he looked up. "That's everything," he said. Eleanor took the pages, read them, looked at the stern letter beside them. "The witness names match," she said quietly. Stern listed the same 2 witnesses in his statement. Caleb looked at Peters. "Both witnesses are still alive. Far as I know. One of them Halverson, he ranches south of town." Peters paused. "The other one moved to Butte last year. Halverson is enough." Caleb turned to Frank. "Can you reach him tonight?" "I know where he lives." "Go." Frank was out the door in under a minute. Peter's wife, a quiet woman named Ruth, who had said almost nothing since arriving, put her hand on her husband's arm. He covered it with his without looking up from the table. Eleanor sat down across from Peters. "You've been carrying this for a year." "Yes, ma'am." "I'm sorry it took this long for someone to make it possible." Peters looked at her. Something in his face moved the particular release of a man who has been told the thing he most needed to hear at the moment he most needed to hear it. "Your father," he said. "He was a decent man. I processed a lot of filings in 6 years. I remember the ones where the person on the other side of that counter was decent." He paused. "He shook my hand when I handed him his receipt. Most people didn't bother." Eleanor said nothing, but her hand resting on the table closed briefly into a fist and then opened again. Caleb watched her and looked away. Monday passed in a tension that had no release valve. Holt made no move on the property. That was almost worse than if he had the stillness of a man who was repositioning, who was working angles that weren't visible yet. Caleb sent Dix and 2 of the ranchers into Ridgefall in the morning to listen, and they came back in the afternoon with news. Holt had sent his lawyer Marsh to Helena on Sunday evening. Telegraph traffic in and out of the Ridgefall office had been heavier than normal since dawn, and Judge Harlan had been seen going in and out of the Grand Hotel twice before noon. "He's trying to get the federal inquiry blocked," Eleanor said. "He's trying," Caleb confirmed. "Aldrich is the question. If Holt can reach someone in the territorial administration above Aldrich who'll pull the inquiry, can he?" Caleb thought about the 4-sentence telegraph Aldrich had sent to the territorial governor's office. Aldrich moved fast, and he moved loud. Holt would need to convince the governor's office that a federal inquiry into land office corruption is politically inconvenient. He paused. "That's possible, not certain. If the inquiry is pulled, then we're back to territorial district court with the injunction active, and Holt's lawyers and his judge and his resources against a deed that he's already successfully buried once." He said it plainly because she needed the plain version. "It gets much harder." She received that without flinching. "What do? We make sure the inspector gets here first." He looked at her steadily. Once a federal inspector has physically arrived and begun examination of the county records. The inquiry can't be pulled without a federal court order from a judge outside Montana territory. That takes weeks. By that point, the record alteration is documented. Peters's testimony is on record, the Stern letter is in evidence, and Holt's competing claim falls apart in open proceeding. So everything depends on Tuesday. Everything depends on Tuesday. She was quiet for a moment. Then, and if Holt tries to stop the inspector from reaching Ridgefall? Caleb had thought about that. Interfering with a federal officer in the performance of his duty is a federal crime. Holt is many things, but he's not a man who commits crimes that explicit. He uses systems. He corrupts process. He doesn't stand in the road and block a federal marshal. He paused. That's his limit. You're sure about that limit? 90%, he said. The other 10% is why I'm not sleeping. Tight. Tuesday came, the way important days always come, with the same indifferent light as every other morning. The sun finding the ridge and coming over it without ceremony. The world deciding nothing. Caleb was at the window when the rider appeared on the north track at 9:30. A single man on a government horse. He could tell the horse by the build and the tack moving at the steady pace of official purpose. He went to the bedroom door and said, "He's here." Eleanor came out already dressed, hair pinned, and the deed and the Stern letter and Peter's written statement already in her hands. She looked at Caleb. He looked at her. "This is it," she said. "This is it," he agreed. She walked to the door and opened it herself. Federal Inspector Nathaniel Cord was a compact man in his late 40s who had the handshake of someone who made judgments quickly and stuck to them. He shook Eleanor's hand first, then Caleb's, and he didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Commissioner Aldrich briefed me thoroughly," he said. "I have written authorization to examine the Gallatin County Land Office registration records, compel production of any materials relevant to the Hayes deed filing, and take sworn testimony from any party with relevant knowledge." He looked at the documents Eleanor had extended to him. "May I?" She gave him everything. He read standing up, which Caleb respected. The Stern letter first, then Peter's reconstructed statement, then the competing claim with the survey date, circled in the margin where Caleb had marked it on the road from Bozeman. He read each document once, then went back to the survey date, and read that section again. "April 14th, he said. "The Hayes deed transfer was registered January 28th, Eleanor said. "The competing claims survey is dated 14 weeks after the property was already legally in my name. And the former filing clerk who processed your filing. Peters. He's at Reverend Moss's church in town. He's prepared to give sworn testimony today." Cord looked up from the papers. "And the witness who signed the original deed, Halverson." "He came in last night," Caleb said. "He's also at the church." Something shifted in Cord's expression. The controlled acknowledgement of a man who has arrived expecting a difficult proceeding and found the ground more solid than anticipated. "I'll go to the land office first," he said. "If the registration record has been altered, the alteration will be visible to examination. You can't change ink in a bound ledger without trace if you know what to look for." He looked at Eleanor. "I know what to look for." "Holt's lawyer is in town," Caleb said. "He may attempt to—" "Mr. Whitmore." Cord's voice was courteous and absolute. "Garrison Holt's lawyer is welcome to observe the examination from outside the land office. He is not welcome inside while a federal inspection is in process." He tucked the documents under his arm. "I've done this before." He mounted his horse and rode toward town. Caleb and Eleanor looked at each other. "We follow," she said. "We follow," he agreed. What happened in the Ridgefall land office that Tuesday morning was the kind of thing that looks quiet from the outside and isn't. Cord went in at 10 o'clock. Marsh was on the boardwalk outside with two of his associates, and he said something to Cord that Caleb couldn't hear from where he stood across the street. Cord listened and then went inside without responding. The door closed. Marsh turned and looked across the street, found Caleb's eyes, held them for a moment with the expression of a man doing a final calculation. Then Marsh walked away toward the Grand Hotel at a pace that was too fast for someone who was comfortable. "He's going to Holt," Eleanor said quietly. "Yes." "What does Holt do now?" "Whatever he does," Caleb said, "it's going to be the wrong thing, because Cord is in that building and the records are in front of him and the next move isn't Holt's anymore." They waited on the street. Tom Briggs was there, and Dix, and two of the ranchers who'd ridden out Monday night. Peters had come in from the church, standing with Frank Calloway, his written statement in his coat pocket, and his wife beside him, and his daughter's hand in his. Halverson, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s who smelled of cattle and moved with the deliberateness of someone accustomed to wait, stood near the land office door with his hat in his hands. Ridgefall went about its morning. People noticed the gathering and didn't ask questions the way small towns don't ask questions when something has been building for a while and everyone already knows the general shape of it. Cord came out of the land office at 11:45. He had a ledger under his arm, a bound register that Caleb recognized as the kind used for county records. He'd carried it out personally, which meant he wasn't leaving it inside. He walked straight to Caleb and Eleanor. "The alteration is present and identifiable," he said. "The Hayes entry was overwritten, the ink is a different age, and the ledger binding shows evidence of a page being separated and reinserted. The original entry dates are still partially legible under the overwriting." He looked at Eleanor. "Your filing date is recoverable, not perfectly but sufficiently." Eleanor put her hand on the porch railing beside her, just for a second. Then she took it back. "And the competing claim," she said. "The Gallatin Valley Land and Water Concern has no valid prior claim to this property." Cord's voice was precise and final. "Their survey predates their own alleged acquisition, which they've dated to," he checked his notes, "March 3rd. They are claiming a survey of property they didn't own yet to establish occupancy that never occurred." He looked up. "It's not a complicated fraud. It's just a confident one." Caleb said, "How long to formalize the finding?" "Written report goes to Commissioner Aldrich by Friday. The commissioner will issue a formal ruling voiding the competing claim and confirming the Hayes deed as the sole valid instrument. The Territorial District Court injunction falls when the federal ruling is issued." He paused. 2 weeks. 3 at the outside." "And Pollard," Eleanor said. "Martin Pollard will be summoned to give testimony before a federal panel in Helena within 30 days. Whether criminal charges follow is a matter for the federal prosecutor." Cord looked at her steadily. "I can tell you that what I found in that ledger constitutes evidence of deliberate record fraud. The prosecutor will have the same opinion." Eleanor was absolutely still. Caleb watched her. She was holding something enormous and holding it without moving. The way structural things hold load, not by being rigid, but by being deeply quietly rooted. She said, "And Garrison Holt." Cord was quiet for one measured moment. "Garrison Holt is a man with lawyers and resources. What happens to him is a longer process." He met her eyes. "But it begins here. Today. With this." He held up the ledger. "A federal finding of fraud doesn't evaporate. It lives in the record. Everything that comes from this, the civil proceedings, the criminal referral, the review of Holt's other land acquisitions in this territory, all of it traces back to what I found this morning." He tucked the ledger under his arm and looked at the group assembled on the street. Peters Halverson, the ranchers. Tom Briggs with his hat off in the morning sun. "I'll need sworn testimony from Mr. Peters and Mr. Halverson this afternoon," he said. "And I'll need yours, Miss Hayes." He tipped his hat to her in the old way. "The property is yours. It was always yours." He walked to the land office to begin the testimony process. The street was quiet for a moment. Then Tom Briggs put his hat back on and said, "Well," just that one word in the tone of a man who has watched something happen that he wasn't entirely sure was going to. Dick said something under his breath that Caleb didn't catch, but that made Frank Calloway exhale and shake his head in what wasn't quite a laugh. Peters's daughter tugged her father's hand, and he looked down at her, and something moved through his face that was too private to observe directly. Caleb turned to Eleanor. She was looking at the land office door where Cord had gone. Her shoulders moved once a single breath deep and released, like a woman putting something down that she'd been carrying for a very long time. Then she looked at Caleb. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that the moment hadn't already said, and he was a man who'd learned the hard way that silence was worth more than words, when words would only get in the way. But she was looking at him with those gray eyes that had been frightened, and then steady, and then fierce, and were now something else entirely, something that didn't require naming to be real, and after a moment she said quietly, "Come home with me." He looked at her. "To the property," she said. And then after a pause that was doing a lot of work. "And after, if you want." He understood what she was asking. It was not a small question, and she had not asked it lightly. He could see the precision of it, the same precision she brought to everything, the careful choosing of words that meant exactly what they were intended to mean. He thought about the forge on his mountain, the cold anvil, Tom Briggs's half-finished axle piece, 15 years of mornings alone. He thought about what it had cost him to live that way, and what it had given him, and whether the accounting still balanced. He said, "My forge is 8 miles up the mountain. I know where your forge is. I've got a half-finished axle piece that Tom needs back." "Tom can wait a few days," Tom said from 6 feet away. Eleanor looked at Caleb, and her mouth moved in the real smile, the one that was sudden and unguarded, and had stopped being a surprise to him and started being something he looked for. Caleb looked at Tom. Tom had the expression of a man who was not apologizing for eavesdropping. He looked back at Eleanor. "All right," he said. 2 words. They carried everything. She held his gaze a moment longer. Then she turned and walked toward the land office to give her testimony, and he watched her go, and the morning settled around them, like something coming right. The weeks that followed moved the way resolutions move, not cleanly or quickly, but with the slow, grinding progress of things that are going correctly even when they don't feel like it. Cord's written report reached Commissioner Aldrich on Thursday. The formal ruling voiding the Gallatin Valley Land and Water Concerns competing claim was issued the following week. The Territorial District Court injunction was dissolved 3 days after that, on the same afternoon that Martin Pollard received his federal summons in Helena, and was observed by multiple witnesses, leaving his office and not returning. Garrison Holt's lawyers filed 2 challenges to the federal ruling. Both were rejected at the territorial level. A third challenge filed in federal court was pending, and would probably be pending for some time, because that was how men like Holt operated when they ran out of winning moves. They kept moving slower and slower until the movement stopped meaning anything. But the land was Eleanor's. The water was Eleanor's. The silver vein on the north face, which the federal ruling confirmed transferred with the deed, was Eleanor's. Caleb found that out from Aldrich's written notification, and he read it twice. And then he rode down to Eleanor's property, a ride he'd been making most mornings for 3 weeks by then, and handed her the document and watched her read it. She read it once, set it down, picked it up and read it again. "He won," she said, and she meant her father. "He did." Caleb agreed. "He planned all of this. The Stern letter, sending me to you, the document in the false bottom." She set the paper down carefully. "He knew. He knew when he transferred the deed that Holt would come for it. He knew what he was leaving me. He knew you could handle it." She looked at him. "He chose well," Caleb said. She'd said it to him twice about her father choosing to send her to him. He meant something slightly different by it now, and they both knew it, and neither of them needed to say so. She folded the document and put it with the deed and the Stern letter in the cloth pouch in the chest. Then she stood and looked at the room around her. The cabin her father had built, the table he'd sat at the window, he'd looked through for 20 years, and she looked at it with the eyes of someone who has just received a thing outright and is registering the full weight of what it means to own something. "I'm going to need help," she said. "With what?" "With the property. With what comes next. If the silver vein is what the mining engineer said it was." She paused. "That's not something I can manage alone, and I don't want to manage it by selling it to someone else who'll run it however they want." He leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed. "You're talking about staying," he said. "I'm talking about building something." She met his eyes directly. "My father built this place for 22 years by himself, and it was good, and it was enough, and then he died, and there was no one to carry it." A pause. "I don't want to repeat that particular pattern." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "My forge," he said. "You can move a forge. An anvil weighs 300 pounds. You moved one up a mountain on a mule." He looked at her. She looked back with the expression of someone who has thought this through and is patient with the pace at which others arrive at conclusions. "You're asking me to stay," he said. "I'm asking you to consider staying." She held his gaze steadily. "I know what you gave up coming down that mountain. I know this isn't simple. I'm not asking you to decide right now." A pause. "I'm asking you to know that the offer is real." He pushed off from the doorframe. He walked to the window and looked out at the property. The high ground, the creek sound just audible from here, the summer grass on the north slope where the silver ran under the ground like a secret the earth had been keeping. He thought about the 15 years on his mountain, what they'd cost him, and what they'd built, and whether what they'd built was something worth protecting or something worth leaving. He thought about a man named Eleanor Hayes who'd shaken a clerk's hand for common courtesy and planned for every contingency except his own death, and had looked at Caleb Whitmore from a distance for years and decided he was worth trusting with the most important thing he had. He thought about Tom Briggs and his 4 children and the axle piece, and Dix and the ranchers who'd ridden out in the dark, and Peters with his journal and his wife's hand, and Frank Calloway, who'd known without being told what was required. He thought about what it had taken, all of it, every mile of hard road and bad weather, and Holt's men, and the ridge, and the commission office, and the land office ledger, and what was on the other side of all of it. He turned around. Eleanor was watching him. She hadn't moved. She was giving him the space to think it through, which was the kind of thing a person did when they understood that a man coming off 15 years of solitude needed the space to arrive at things on his own terms. "I'm going to need to go back up the mountain," he said. Something moved in her face. "Finish Tom's axle piece," he said. "Close the forge properly. Bring the anvil down." He held her gaze. "Takes about a week if the weather holds." The thing that moved in Eleanor Hayes's face was the real smile and everything beyond it, and it was not brief this time. It stayed. "A week is fine," she said. "And when I come back, you'll need somewhere to put the forge," she said. "I've been thinking about the east side of the barn. Good clearance, solid ground." He looked at her. "You've been planning this for a while," he said. "I've been considering the possibility," she said. "For about 11 days. 11 days, give or take?" He shook his head slowly. It was the closest he'd come to laughing in longer than he could account for. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. He went back up the mountain that afternoon. The ride was the same 8 miles. It had always been the same trail, through the same timber, the same view from the high point that looked back down over the valley. He'd ridden it hundreds of times. It felt different. He finished Tom Briggs's axle piece on Wednesday. It came out right clean and solid, the way good work came out when a man gave it full attention. Tom came up Thursday morning to collect it and stood in the forge for a moment, looking at the piece, and then at Caleb, and then at the cabin. "You're coming down," he said. "Yes." Tom turned the axle piece over in his hands. "Eleanor Hayes's place." "Yes." Tom didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "My wife said she thought that was coming. 3 days ago. Before you'd said anything to anyone." He put the piece under his arm. "Said she could tell from how you looked at her that first night at the church." Caleb said, "How did I look at her?" Tom. Briggs smiled. It was a broad and genuine smile, and it made him look 10 years younger. Like a man who'd been standing in the cold for a long time and had finally walked inside. He tucked the axle piece under his arm and rode back down the mountain, and Caleb stood in the forge for a moment in the quiet that he'd lived in for 15 years and took the measure of it. The forge was cold. The tools were hung. The anvil, 300 pounds of iron, that had belonged to Herschel Grady and had come up this mountain on a mule, and had been the center of everything Caleb had built, here sat in the middle of the space the way it always had, permanent and immovable. He'd need 4 men and a wagon and the better part of a day to move it. He already knew who to ask. On Saturday morning, Dix and Frank and Tom and a rancher named Eli showed up with a flatbed wagon at 6 in the morning without being told the time, and the 4 of them got the anvil down by noon, in a process that involved 2 near disasters, and one moment where Caleb and Frank were both holding onto a rope with everything they had, while the anvil swung 6 inches off the wagon bed in a direction it wasn't supposed to go. "Heavier than it looks," Dix said. "I've been telling people that for 15 years, Caleb said. They ate at Tom's place after, and rode down to the valley in the late afternoon, and Caleb rode the last 2 miles to the Hayes property alone ahead of the wagon, with the summer light going long and gold the way it did in August in Montana, and the creek sound coming up to meet him before he could see the cabin. Eleanor came out to the yard when she heard the horse. She looked at him, then at the wagon coming down the track behind him, with the anvil on it, then back at him. "You brought the forge tools too," she said. "You said east side of the barn." "I said east side of the barn." He dismounted. She was closer than the ordinary distance of conversation, and she was looking up at him with those gray eyes that had been the first clear thing he'd seen after 15 years of looking at the same mountain every morning. He said, "Your father built something worth keeping," she said. "Yes. I intend to help you keep it." She reached out and put her hand on his arm, a direct gesture, unhurried, the kind that doesn't require explanation. He looked at her hand, and then at her face. And what was in her face was the kind of certainty that is not confidence exactly, but is something more durable than confidence. The certainty of a person who has been tested at significant cost and knows what they're made of and what they want. He covered her hand with his. They stood in the yard in the August evening while Dix and Frank and Tom wrestled the anvil off the wagon with considerable profanity and some creative problem-solving, and neither of them moved, and neither of them needed to. 6 months later, the federal prosecutor in Helena filed charges against Martin Pollard for fraud and falsification of official records. Pollard entered a guilty plea in January and was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. Garrison Holt's third legal challenge was rejected by the federal court in February. His lawyers filed no fourth challenge. Holt withdrew from the Montana Territory the following spring, not loudly, not with any announcement, but with the quiet departure of a man who has concluded that a particular ground is no longer worth contesting. The families he'd pushed out of their land got nothing back directly because that was not how the law worked, but 2 of them were able to use the federal fraud finding to reopen civil suits that had been dismissed, and one of those suits settled in their favor the following year. James Peters was formally exonerated of the misconduct charge that had cost him his position. He was offered reinstatement at the Gallatin County Land Office. He took it. Martin Pollard's position was filled by a clerk from Butte, who had no connection to anyone in particular, and who processed filings with the meticulous attention to detail that the job required. He shook people's hands when he handed them their receipts. The silver vein on the north face of the Hayes property was assessed properly that autumn, and the figure it returned was significant enough that Eleanor spent 3 weeks thinking carefully about what she wanted to do with it. She wrote to 2 mining engineers. She wrote to a lawyer in Helena who came recommended by Aldrich. She made a plan that involved careful extraction with equitable profit sharing for the ranch families who held water rights agreements, a structure that her father would have recognized as consistent with the way he'd thought about land and neighbors and obligation. She discussed it all with Caleb. He had opinions which surprised him, because he'd spent 15 years in a life that didn't require opinions about much beyond the quality of iron and the weather. He had more to say than he'd expected, and she listened with the same focused attention she brought to everything. And they disagreed twice, once about the profit-sharing structure, and once about the rate of extraction, and both times the disagreement produced something better than either of them had started with. The forge on the east side of the barn was operational by October. Caleb built it with Frank Calloway's help and Tom Briggs' occasional supervision of structural matters, and when it was done, it was better positioned than the one he'd left on the mountain. Better airflow, better light, better access for people who needed to bring work to it. Because people came, not just from the Hayes property, from the valley ranches, and from Ridgefall, and from homesteads up the slope that Caleb hadn't known existed. Word moved the way word moves in communities not fast but sure, and the word was that there was a man at the Hayes property who did work that needed doing, and didn't charge widows, and didn't ask for credit, and whose work held. Tom Briggs said one morning in November, when he'd brought a broken plow blade and stayed for coffee. "You know what they're calling you in town?" Caleb was at the anvil. No. "The man who came down from the mountain." Caleb looked at him. Tom smiled. "They mean it as a good thing." Eleanor was in the doorway of the barn with 2 cups of coffee, and she'd heard it, and her expression was the real smile, steady and uncomplicated. Caleb turned back to the plow blade. "Long as the work's good," he said. "Work's good," Tom said.
Umitar says.
The first snow came in December, earlier than usual, and it came heavy the way Montana snow comes when it's decided to commit to something. Caleb was in the barn with the forge going, and the warmth of it making the cold outside into something that could be heard but not felt. And Eleanor came in from the cabin with her coat on, and her hair down, and 2 plates of food, and set them on the work table without asking whether he was ready to stop. He stopped. They ate in the warmth of the forge with the snow coming down outside and the horses moving quietly in the stalls behind them, and neither of them talked for a while, because there are people you can be quiet with in a way that isn't absence, but is its own kind of presence. After a while, Eleanor said, "My father would have sat exactly here." In the forge. Near enough. He liked to watch people work. She looked at the fire. "He said you could tell more about a person from how they worked than from anything they said." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "What do you think you can tell about me?" he said. She looked at him. Not the considering look, not the calculating look, the direct one, the one that had no intermediary between what she felt and what she showed. "That you're a man who does what needs doing," she said, "and that you've been waiting a long time for it to need doing somewhere that felt like home." He looked at her. Outside, the snow was coming down on the Hayes property on the creek that ran cold and clear from the high north face on the silver that ran beneath the north slope on the valley below where 7 families brought their cattle to water that had stayed where it belonged on the grave in the far corner of the property where Daniel Hayes was buried under a pine that was older than anyone could account for. Caleb set down his plate. He said Eleanor. She looked at him. He said it the way he'd said everything to her since she'd arrived on his mountain without excess, without decoration, in the plain language of a man who had learned that what was true didn't need assistance to be heard. "I was wrong," he said, "about living alone being easier." She was still watching him. "It was easier," he said, "but it wasn't better." He held her gaze. "You're the difference between those 2 things." The forge fire moved behind him, and the snow fell outside, and Eleanor Hayes looked at the man across from her, the mountain cowboy who had come down to stand for something worth standing for, and had found in the standing that the thing he'd given up on had been here all along, waiting in the form of a woman who rode hard and thought clearly and loved her father's land and made room in all of it for him, and she said simply, "I know." And she meant it the way real things are meant, completely without reservation, with the full weight of someone who has been tested and knows the difference between what holds and what doesn't. Outside, the snow kept coming. Inside, the forge burned warm, and Caleb Whitmore, who had spent 15 years on a mountain learning to live without needing anything, understood at last that the bravest thing a person could do was not to need nothing, but to let themselves need something true, and to stay. That was where the story of the lonely mountain cowboy ended, and where everything else began.